Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Ezra Whitlock, and I've been a park ranger for 18 years. I've seen plenty of strange things in the mountains, but nothing like what happened in November of 1980. Nothing that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. I grew up in these Virginia mountains, in coal mining country. My daddy died in a cave-in when I was 12, crushed under 1 million tons of rock and dirt. That's why I became a ranger instead of a miner. I wanted to stay in the mountains, but I swore I'd never go underground again. Funny how life works out. The George Washington National Forest covers thousands of acres, but my beat was the worst part. Devil's Backbone Ridge. 12 miles of jagged limestone cliffs, deep caves, and old mine shafts from the 1800s. Most rangers avoided it. Too dangerous, too remote. 23 miles from the nearest road, and the radio doesn't work in half the valleys. I liked it that way. Quiet, peaceful, just me in the mountains. That changed on November 15th when the college kids went missing. 3 geology students from Virginia Tech had permits to survey the cave systems. Standard stuff. They were mapping underground water sources for their thesis project. Smart kids, experienced cavers. They'd checked in with me 2 days before, showed me their equipment, their route plans. Everything looked good. They were supposed to radio in every 12 hours. When I didn't hear from them for 24, I started to worry. When 36 hours passed, I grabbed my gear and headed up the ridge. The weather was turning ugly. November in the mountains can be brutal, and I could smell snow in the air. Thick gray clouds were building over the peaks, and the wind had that sharp bite that meant a storm was coming. Not the kind of weather you want to be stuck in a cave. I found their camp in a clearing near the main cave entrance. 3 tents, and still staked down properly. Sleeping bags laid out neat and tidy. Their food was hanging in bear bags exactly like they should, but no students. Here's where things got strange. All their caving equipment, ropes, helmets, lights, survey tools, was laid out in perfect circles around the cave mouth. Not scattered like they'd dropped it. Not packed like they'd finished for the day. Arranged, like someone had placed each item exactly where it needed to be. I called out their names. Sarah, Mike, Tommy. My voice echoed off the limestone cliffs, but nobody answered. Just that echo, bouncing back and forth until it faded into silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I should have called for backup right then. Standard procedure for missing persons is to get a full team up there, set up a proper search grid, do everything by the book. But the radio was dead. Happens a lot in these mountains. And with the storm coming, I figured I'd better check the cave first. Just a quick look. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped inside. The main cave entrance is about 10 feet wide and twice as tall. Most tourists get maybe 50 feet in before the passage narrows and they turn around. But this cave system goes deep. Real deep. Some of the passages connect to mine shafts that haven't been mapped since the 1890s. The temperature dropped 20 degrees as soon as I stepped inside. That's normal for caves. They stay the same temperature year-round. But this felt different. Colder than it should be, even for November. And quiet. Too quiet. In 18 years of cave work, I'd never been in one this silent. No water dripping, no air moving, no bats. That should have been my first real warning. There should have been hundreds of bats hibernating in there. But I didn't see or hear a single one. I followed their footprints in the sandy cave floor, 3 sets of boot prints, heading deeper into the mountain. The prints looked normal at first, just 3 people walking single file like experienced cavers do. But about 100 feet in, something changed. The footprints started to get messy, scuffed. Like they'd been running, or struggling. That's when I found the first bone. It was lying right in the middle of the passage, white as fresh snow. Looked like part of a human arm bone, but I'm no expert. What bothered me wasn't the bone itself, People have been dying in these caves for over a century. What bothered me was how clean it was. Picked clean. And it was sitting on top of the students' footprints, like someone had placed it there after the kids walked by. I picked it up with my handkerchief, careful not to touch it directly. As I did, I heard something that made every hair on my neck stand up. Tap, tap, tap. 3 slow, deliberate taps coming from deeper in the cave. I stopped breathing and listened. For maybe 10 seconds, nothing. Then, tap, tap, tap. Same rhythm, same spacing. But this time it was coming from a different direction, off to my left, where a side passage branched off into darkness. Then I heard it again, from my right this time. And again, from somewhere behind me. Someone, or something, was tapping in the caves all around me. And they were taking turns, like they were talking to each other in some kind of code. I should have left right then. Should have backed out of that cave, called for help, waited for a full team. But those kids were down there somewhere, and the storm was coming. If they were hurt, they might not survive another night in the mountains. So I kept going deeper. The passage sloped downward for about another 200 feet before it opened into a larger chamber. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the far walls, but I could tell the space was big by the way my footsteps echoed. The students' tracks led straight across the chamber floor to another passage on the far side. But there were other tracks, too. Lots of them. Bare feet mostly, but some in old boots. The bare foot track. S looked wrong somehow. Too long, too narrow. Like human feet, but stretched out. I was halfway across the chamber when my flashlight started acting up. The beam kept dimming and brightening on its own, like the batteries were dying. But I'd put fresh ones in that morning. Then the beam started to bend. I know that sounds crazy, but that's what happened. The light would hit the cave wall straight on, but instead of making a round spot, it would curve to one side like something was pulling it. I tapped the flashlight against my palm, and it went back to normal for a few seconds, then started bending again. That's when I noticed I wasn't alone in the chamber. At first, I thought it was just rock formations, stalagmites maybe, or flowstone deposits. But then one of them moved, just a little. A slight shift in the shadows at the edge of my light. I swung the beam toward it, but there was nothing there. Just bare cave wall. "Hello?" I called out. "Sarah? Mike? Tommy?" My voice bounced around the chamber and came back distorted, like it was being filtered through something. And underneath the echo, I thought I heard something else, a whisper maybe, or breathing. The tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. But now it was coming from at least 6 different directions, all around the chamber. Like I was surrounded. I pulled out my backup flashlight and clicked it on. The extra light helped, but it also showed me something I wish I hadn't seen. The chamber walls were covered in paintings, not cave paintings like you see in museums. These were crude, done with what looked like mud and charcoal and something rust-colored that I didn't want to think about. But they told a story. The first paintings showed people on the surface, normal people, with the sun and trees and houses, happy stick figures living their lives. The next set showed the same people being pulled underground, ragged into caves by tall, thin shapes with 2 long arms and legs. The last paintings showed what happened to those people after they'd been underground for a while. Their bodies stretched, out. Their eyes got bigger. Their skin turned white as bone. They became something else. I'm not a superstitious man. 18 years in the woods teaches you that most mysteries have simple explanations. Bears, not monsters. Weather, not spirits. Lost hikers, not alien abductions. But standing in that chamber, surrounded by tapping sounds and impossible paintings, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a kid, afraid of the dark. Pure terror. I should have turned around right then, should have gotten out while I could. But those students were still missing, and I could see their footprints leading to the passage on the far side of the chamber. I followed them. The new passage was narrower, barely wide enough for one person. The ceiling dropped low enough that I had to duck in places, and it kept going down, deeper into the mountain. The air was getting colder and staler, like it hadn't moved in years. After about 5 minutes of walking, I started to smell something. At first, I thought it was the musty cave smell you get from bat droppings and old water, but this was different, sharper. like metal that had been sitting in the damp too long. And underneath that, something else. Something organic and wrong. The passage curved to the right, and suddenly I was looking into another chamber. This one was smaller, maybe the size of a school classroom, but it was occupied. There were people in there. At least they looked like people from a distance. They were sitting in a circle around what looked like a campfire, but there was no fire. Just a pile of glowing rocks giving off a pale green light that hurt my eyes. I counted 12 of them, men, women, hard to tell ages in the weird light. They were all thin as fence posts and white as sheets. Their hair was long and tangled, and they wore a mixture of old clothes, some that looked like they might have been from the 1800s, others more recent. They were having some kind of meeting, talking in low voices, but not in any language I recognized. It sounded like English played backwards or underwater, and every few seconds one of them would tap on the cave floor. 3 taps, same rhythm I'd been hearing. I was trying to figure out if any of them were the missing students when one of them looked right at me. Her head turned smooth as oil, like an owl's, until she was facing my direction. Her eyes were huge, taking up half her face, and they reflected the green light like an animal's. She looked at me for maybe 3 seconds, then opened her mouth and made a sound. Not a scream, not a shout. Something between a whistle and a hiss that seemed to go on forever. The others all turned toward me then. 12 pairs of huge, glowing eyes staring at me from across the chamber, and they all started to smile. I ran. I don't remember much about getting back to the surface. I know I dropped my backup flashlight somewhere in the narrow passage. I know I scraped my hands and knees crawling through spaces that seemed to be getting smaller. And I know that behind me, I could hear them following. Not footsteps. They moved too quiet for that. But I could hear them breathing, and occasionally that whistle-hiss sound, and always the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Getting closer. I made it to the main chamber, then to the entrance passage, and finally stumbled out into the gray November daylight. It had started to snow while I was underground. Big, wet flakes that stung my face and melted on my jacket. I ran all the way back to their camp, grabbed the radio from my truck and tried to call for backup. Nothing but static. The storm was interfering with the signal, and anyway, who would believe what I'd seen? I sat in my truck for maybe an hour, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it had been some kind of hallucination. Bad air in the caves, carbon dioxide poisoning. Maybe stress and the weird lighting had made me see things that weren't there. But then I looked at the cave entrance, and I knew it hadn't. Been my imagination. There were people standing there. The same pale, thin people I'd seen underground. They weren't hiding or trying to stay out of sight. They were just standing there in the snow, watching me, waiting. I spent that night in my truck, engine running, heater on, radio crackling with static. Every few minutes I'd look toward the cave entrance, and they'd still be there, just standing, waiting. By morning they were gone. The snow had stopped and the radio was working again. I called in the missing persons report and waited for backup. While I waited, I searched the students' camp more thoroughly. That's when I found the journal. It was wedged under a rock near the fire pit, wrapped in plastic. The handwriting was shaky, like whoever wrote it was scared or cold or both. Day 1. Cave system is bigger than we thought. Found passages that aren't on any of the survey maps. Sarah wants to explore the deep sections tomorrow. I told her we should stick to the mapped areas, but she says we'll never get another chance like this. Day 2. Sarah was right. These caves go on forever. We found evidence of old mining operations, maybe from the 1800s. Tools, rail cart tracks, even some old dynamite. But here's the weird part. Some of the tools look like they're still being used. Fresh tool marks on the walls. Mike thinks it might be modern cavers, but who would want to work down here? Day 3. We're lost. We've been following what we thought was the main passage for hours, but nothing looks familiar. The compass isn't working right. It keeps spinning like there's magnetic interference. Sarah thinks we're going deeper instead of back toward the entrance. The air is getting colder, and our lights keep dimming. And we're not alone down here. We keep hearing sounds, tapping mostly, but also voices. People talking, but we can't understand what they're saying. When, we call out, they stop talking, but we can hear them moving around in the dark. Sarah found bones today. Human bones arranged in patterns around what looked like old campsites. She says they're probably from miners who died in cave-ins, but these bones are clean. Too clean, like something picked them clean. Mike is starting to panic. He wants to find a passage and follow it straight up until we reach the surface, even if it takes us miles from where we started. Sarah wants to keep exploring. She says she found paintings on the walls that show this place has been occupied for a long time. I just want to go home. The journal ended there. 3 days underground, and then nothing. By noon, I had a full search team on the ridge. 6 rangers, 4 state police officers, and a cave rescue specialist from Charlottesville. We spent the day searching every mapped passage in the system, calling out names, following any sign of the students. We found their gear scattered throughout the caves. A helmet here, a water bottle there, survey equipment dropped in passages that didn't appear on any map. But no students. What we did find was evidence that someone had been living in the caves for a long time. Not camping. Living. We found crude shelters built into alcoves, fire pits made from stacked stones, and tools fashioned from metal scraps. Some of the metal looked like it came from old mining equipment, but some was clearly modern, pieces of cars, appliances, things that had been hauled down from the surface. And we found more bones. Lots more bones. All human, all cleaned, all arranged in patterns that made no sense to any of us. The cave rescue specialist, a guy named Dave Martinez, had been working caves for 20 years. He'd seen plenty of bodies, cavers who got lost, miners who died in accidents, even murder victims who'd been dumped underground. But he'd never seen anything like this. It's like a museum, he told me, like someone's been collecting these bones for decades, maybe longer. We worked until dark and didn't find any trace of the living. Students. As the team packed up to leave, Martinez pulled me aside. There's something else, he said. Something I didn't want to mention in front of the others. He handed me a piece of paper, a photocopy of a page from an old book. I found this in the library last night after you called about the missing cavers. It's from a mining survey report from 1887. Look at the date. The page was titled Incident Report, Devil's Backbone Mining Operation. It described how a section of miners had refused to come to the surface after their shift ended. When the foreman went down to get them, he found their work area abandoned, but he could hear them talking somewhere deeper in the mine. They went after them, Martinez continued, sent down a search party with lanterns and rope. Found the missing miners 3 days later, about a mile deeper than anyone had ever gone, but they weren't the same. According to the report, the miners had changed. Their skin had turned pale from lack of sunlight. Their eyes had grown larger to see in the dark, and they refused to come back to the surface. The mining company sealed the shafts after that, Martinez said. Official reason was safety concerns, but the real reason is right there in the report. They were afraid of what the miners had become. I read the report twice, then looked at Martinez. You think they're still down there? I think something's still down there, and I think it's been taking people for a long time. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the pale people I'd seen at the cave entrance, about the journal entries, about miners who refused to see sunlight. I kept thinking about those 3 college students, alone in the dark, with whatever lived in the deep places of the mountain. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep, grabbed my gear, and drove back to Devil's Backbone. This time I was going to get answers. I went in alone, against every rule in the book, but I knew the other rangers wouldn't follow me into what I was planning to do. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The cave entrance was empty, no pale figures standing guard, just darkness and the sound of my own breathing. I had better equipment this time, 3 flashlights, extra batteries, emergency flares, and a headlamp. I also had something else. My grandfather's mining lantern from when he worked the coal mines in Kentucky. Carbide flame burns bright and steady, and something told me I was going to need steady light where I was going. I followed the same route I'd taken the day before, past the chamber with the impossible paintings, through the narrow passage that led down into the mountain's belly. But this time, I didn't stop at the chamber where I'd seen the pale people. I kept going deeper. The passage continued past their gathering place, sloping down at a steep angle. The walls were no longer natural limestone. They were carved, shaped by tools and human hands. Old mining work, but not like anything I'd seen before. These passages were perfectly round, smooth as glass, like they'd been melted rather than dug, and they were warm. The deeper I went, the warmer it got, until I had to take off my jacket. That didn't make sense. Caves are supposed to maintain constant temperature, and deeper usually means colder. But the air down here felt like summer, thick and humid. I'd been walking for maybe an hour when I heard voices. Not the backward-sounding language I'd heard before. English, American accents. A woman and two men talking in low, urgent voices. "Sarah? Mike? Tommy?" I called out. The voices stopped immediately. Then I heard footsteps running toward me. A young woman stumbled out of a side passage, and I recognized her from the photos her parents had given us. Sarah Chen, 21 years old, geology major from Virginia Tech. But she'd changed. Her skin was pale as milk, and her eyes were twice the size they should be. Her hair had grown longer, hanging down past her, shoulders in tangled knots. She was wearing the same clothes she'd disappeared in 3 days ago, but they were torn and dirty. Behind her came the two young men, Mike and Tommy. They'd changed too, but not as much as Sarah. Their skin was just starting to lose its color, and their eyes were beginning to grow. "Thank God," Sarah said, and her voice sounded almost normal. "We've been trying to find our way out for days. These caves go on forever, and we kept getting turned around." I wanted to believe her, wanted to think I'd found them and everything was going to be fine, but something was wrong, something beyond the physical changes. "How long have you been down here?" I asked. 3 days, Mike said. "Maybe 4. It's hard to tell time without sunlight." But I'd read Sarah's journal. They'd been down here at least a week, maybe longer. And according to the dates in the journal, Sarah had been the one who kept wanting to go deeper, not the one trying to get out. "Come on," I said. "Let's get you back to the surface." Sarah smiled, and her teeth looked too sharp. "Actually, there's something we want to show you first. We found something amazing down here. Something that's going to change everything we know about cave formation." She started walking back the way she'd come, toward the deeper passages. Mike and Tommy fell in beside her, moving in perfect step, like they'd rehearsed it. I didn't follow. "The exit's that way," I said, pointing back up the passage. All 3 of them turned to look at me, and their eyes reflected my headlamp light like animals' eyes. Sarah's smile got wider. "Don't you want to see what we found?" she asked. "Don't you want to know the truth about this place?" That's when I noticed the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Coming from all around us, from passages I couldn't see. We were surrounded. "The truth is that you've been down here a lot longer than that. And 3 days, I said. "And you're not the same people who went missing." Sarah's smile disappeared. When she spoke again, her voice was different, older, like it was coming from someone who'd lived in the dark for a very long time. "No," she said. "We're not." The tapping got louder, more urgent. And then they came out of the side passages. The pale people I'd seen before, moving fast and silent. But now I could see them clearly in my headlamp beam. They had been human once. Some recently, like the students. Others much longer ago. Their transformations were complete. Skin white as bone, eyes huge and black, limbs stretched long and thin. They moved like spiders, all angles and quick, jerky motions. But they were still people. I could see it in their faces, in the way they looked at me. There was intelligence there, and sadness, and something that might have been hunger. "We don't want to hurt you," Sarah said, and she sounded like herself again for a moment. "But we can't let you leave. Not yet. Not until you understand." "Understand what?" That this is better. That the surface world is dying, but down here we can live forever. We can become something more than human. The pale people were getting closer, forming a circle around me. I counted at least 20, maybe more. Some were carrying tools, pickaxes, shovels, things that looked like they'd been sharpened into weapons. The mining company knew, Sarah continued, back in the 1800s. They found us down here, the first ones who chose to stay underground. They tried to seal us in, but you can't seal mountains. There are always other ways in, other ways out. What happened to the original miners? I asked. An old man stepped forward from the group. He was more changed than the others, barely recognizable as human anymore. But when he spoke, his voice had a Kentucky accent that sounded familiar. We chose this, and he said, chose the dark over the light, the deep over the surface, and we've been waiting ever since for others to join us. I realized who he was. The family resemblance was still there, despite the changes. My great-grandfather, who'd disappeared in a mine collapse in 1923. Except there hadn't been any collapse. He'd just gone deeper, and he'd been waiting for me. Ezra, the old man said, and his voice was full of sadness and love and something that might have been madness. I wondered if you'd ever find your way down here. I should have been terrified. I should have run, or fought, or done something other than stand there staring at a man who should have been dead for 60 years. But all I could think was that he looked like my father. Same eyes, same nose, same stubborn jaw, just stretched and changed and made pale by decades in the dark. Great-Grandpa Silas? I said. He smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp and too many. I've been watching your family for years, boy. Watched your father go into the coal mines even though he had other choices. Watched you become a ranger so you could stay in the mountains but avoid going underground. I always hoped you'd change your mind. The other pale people were getting restless, shifting from foot to foot, making that whistle hiss sound I'd heard before. Sarah and the other students were changing too, their eyes growing larger, their skin getting paler even as I watched. You don't have much time, Silas said. The change happens fast once it starts. Those three have been fighting it for days, but they're losing. Soon they won't remember what the surface world was like. What do you want from me? I want you to choose. Same choice your father never got to make. Same choice I made 90 years ago. You can go back to the surface and live your short human life, watching the world get uglier and more poisoned every year. Or you can stay here with us and become something better. Better how? Sarah spoke up, but her voice was different now. Hollow, like it was coming from far away. We don't get sick, do? Own here. Don't age like surface people do. Don't have to worry about wars or pollution or any of the things that are destroying the world above. But we need new people, Silas added. Need fresh blood to keep our community strong. That's why we take the cavers, the miners, the ones who are already drawn to the deep places. They adapt easier. I looked around at the pale faces watching me. Some of them might have been human once, but they weren't anymore. They were something else, something that belonged in the dark spaces beneath the world, and they wanted me to become one of them. If I say no? Silas shrugged. Then you leave, and you seal the cave entrances behind you like the mining company did, and we find other ways to the surface, and we take other people. People who don't have a choice. I thought about that. About hikers and cavers and anyone else who might wander into these mountains. About them disappearing one by one, pulled down into the dark to feed a colony of things that used to be human. Then I thought about the emergency flares in my backpack. I need time to think, I said. Silas nodded. Time is something we have plenty of down here. But choose quickly, boy. The longer you stay, the harder it gets to leave. I could feel it already, a strange pulling sensation in my chest. The air down here was thick and sweet, and it was making me dizzy, making me think that maybe staying wouldn't be so bad. Maybe they were right about the surface world being poisoned and dying. Maybe this was better. I shook my head hard, trying to clear it. That was the cave air talking, not me. I'd seen what these things did to people, how they changed them. I wasn't going to let that happen to me. But I also couldn't leave knowing they'd just take other people. I reached into my backpack and pulled out an emergency flare. The pale people stepped back when they saw the red tube in my hand. "Light," Silas said, and his voice was full of fear. "We can't. The light burns us now. Please, Ezra." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "But I can't let you keep taking people." I pulled the ignition cord. The flare exploded into brilliant red light, brighter than the sun, turning the cave into day. The pale people screamed and scattered, covering their huge eyes, stumbling over each other to get away from the light. I lit 2 more flares and threw them down different passages, then started running toward the surface. Behind me I could hear them shrieking and crying, but they couldn't follow. The light was too much for their changed eyes. It took me 2 hours to get out of the caves, and by the time I reached the surface, the flares had burned out. I called in a full team, and we spent the next week sealing every cave entrance we could find with concrete and steel barriers. Official reports said the students died in a cave-in, that their bodies were never recovered. I got a commendation for my rescue efforts and a week of paid leave to recover from the trauma of losing civilians on my watch. But I know the truth. They're still down there. All of them. Silas, the students, the miners from 100 years ago, and probably dozens of others I never saw. Still living in the dark, still changing, still hungry for new people to join their underground family. And sometimes, late at night when I'm patrolling the mountain roads, I can hear them, tap, 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 coming from storm drains and culverts, from places where the underground connects to the surface. They're looking for new ways up, new ways to find people like those college students, people who won't be missed right away. So if you ever go caving, especially in the old mining areas, remember this story. If you hear tapping sounds that seem organized, if you see equipment arranged in perfect patterns, if the cave feels too warm or too quiet, get out. Get out fast, and don't look back. Because there are things living in the deep places of the world that used to be human but aren't anymore. And they're always looking for new neighbors. My name is Martha Crowfeather, and I've been a park ranger at Shenandoah for 15 years. People always ask about the name, half Cherokee from my grandmother's side, half Scottish stubborn from my father's. The Cherokee part usually makes folks think I believe in all the old stories about spirits and cursed places. Truth is, I never put much stock in that stuff. When you've pulled bodies off rock faces for 15 years, you learn that gravity and human error kill people just fine without any help from ghosts. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the Bone Bridge and what happened there in September of 1983. Maybe then you'll understand why I put in for transfer to a desk job the very next week, and why I still wake up some nights thinking about that awful clicking sound. The Bone Bridge sits deep in the old Rag Wilderness, about 8 hours of technical climbing from the nearest marked trail. It's not really a bridge at all. Just a natural arch of quartzite that somebody millions of years ago carved out a 400-foot gorge. The Cherokee called it Nvi Atsila, the Bone Crossing. Said it was where spirits went from our world to theirs. Local tribes wouldn't go near it, wouldn't even hunt in that area. White settlers who found it in the 1800s started calling it Dead Man's Bridge after the 3rd body turned up at the bottom of that gorge. I always figured it was just a dangerous place with scary stories built around it. Hell, half the people who tried to reach it shouldn't have been climbing anything steeper than a stepladder. The approach required advanced rock skills, and the weather up there could turn nasty without warning. Fog rolled in from nowhere. Wind patterns got weird because of all those rock formations. Perfect recipe for accidents, no spirits required. That's what I thought anyway, until Chief Ranger Morrison called me into his office on September 15th. "Martha, I need you to check on something out at the Bone Bridge," he said, not looking up from his paperwork. Morrison was a good boss, but he had this way of dropping bombshells like he was asking you to pick up his dry cleaning. "What kind of something?" "Got a report from a climbing group that came down yesterday. Said they saw lights moving around the bridge at night. Weird lights moving in patterns." I snorted. "Probably headlamps from another group." Or maybe they were tired and seeing things. You know how that place messes with people's heads. Morrison finally looked at me. That's what I figured too. But then this morning I got a call from the Cherokee Cultural Center. Seems like some of the elders are asking questions about activity up there. They want to know if we've got people disturbing sacred sites. That got my attention. The Cherokee weren't troublemakers. If they were calling, they had a reason. You want me to go up there and look around? I want you to go up there and figure out what those climbers really saw. Could be illegal camping, could be drug activity, could be nothing at all. But I need someone with your skills to get in there and get back out safely. I nodded. When do you want me to go? Tomorrow. Weather's supposed to hold clear for the next 3 days. Take the emergency radio, though I doubt you'll get signal down in that gorge. That night I packed my gear with the usual pre-climb ritual. Technical hardware went into specific pockets where I could find it by feel. Emergency supplies got distributed so losing one piece wouldn't kill me. I'd made this climb twice before. Once during ranger training, once to recover a body 3 years ago. Both times, the place had felt wrong somehow, but I'd chalked it up to the isolation and the grim history. My grandmother used to tell stories about places where the world was thin, where our reality brushed up against something else. Some places are doorways, Edota, she'd say in that quiet voice she used for serious things. Smart people don't go, knocking on doors they can't close. I'd always figured that was just old superstition. Grandmother had been born in 1898, raised on stories from people who remembered when the Cherokee still lived in these mountains. Of course, she believed in spirits and sacred places, but I was a park ranger in 1983. I believed in hypothermia and falling rocks and people making stupid decisions in dangerous places. Looking back, I wonder if grandmother would have laughed at how wrong I was, or if she would have been too scared to laugh at all. The hike to the base of the technical section took me 4 hours, following deer trails and creek beds through dense forest that hadn't seen a chainsaw since the park was established. By noon, I was gearing up at the bottom of what climbers called the Devil's Staircase, 800 feet of near-vertical quartzite that led to the bridge approach. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, not even the buzz of insects. Just the sound of wind moving through rock formations somewhere high above. In 15 years of backcountry work, I'd learned to pay attention when the wildlife went silent. It usually meant predators around or storms coming or something else that made animals nervous. I started climbing anyway. The rock was good. Solid holds, predictable cracks for protection. About 300 feet up, I found the first sign that someone else had been there recently. A brand new piece of climbing hardware wedged into a crack, still shiny with machine oil. Expensive gear, not the kind of thing most people would leave behind by accident. Another 100 feet up, I found a second piece, then a third. All high-end equipment, all abandoned in perfect placement positions. It was like someone had been climbing this route and just decided to gift the mountain their entire rack of gear. That's when I start. I had to feel watched. You know that prickle between your shoulder blades when someone's staring at you? It was like that, but stronger. Like something big and patient was studying every move I made. I kept climbing, but I found myself glancing around more than usual, searching for movement in the shadows between rock formations. The feeling got stronger as I gained elevation. By the time I reached the narrow ledge that led to the bridge approach, my nerves were humming like high-tension wires. I clipped into an anchor point and took a break, forcing myself to eat some trail mix and drink water while I scanned the area. That's when I saw the scratches. They were carved deep into the rock face about 20 feet to my right, long parallel gouges that looked like claw marks. But they were too big to be from any animal I knew about, and too fresh to be ancient. The stone around them was lighter colored, like they'd been made recently enough that weathering hadn't darkened them yet. I rappelled over to get a closer look. The marks were each about 8 inches long, and they went deep into the quartzite. Whatever made them had serious power behind it. I ran my fingers along the grooves, trying to figure out what kind of tool could have carved stone like that. That's when I heard the clicking. It was faint at first, like rocks tapping together somewhere in the distance. But it had a rhythm to it. Click, click, pause, click, click, pause. too regular to be natural erosion or wind-blown debris. The sound seemed to come from above, from the direction of the bridge itself. I looked up, following the ledge system that would take me to the arch. Nothing visible, but the clicking continued. And underneath it, so quiet I almost missed it, was another sound, like something large moving across stone with careful, deliberate steps. My radio crackled. Nothing but static, of course, we were too deep in the gorge for any signal to get through. But the static seemed to pulse in time with the clicking sounds, and for just a second I could swear I heard something that might have been a voice buried in the white noise. The scratches in the rock suddenly seemed a lot more ominous. I'd been planning to continue up to the bridge itself, but every instinct I'd developed in 15 years of wilderness work was telling me to retreat. The abandoned gear, the claw marks, the strange sounds, it all added up to a situation that felt dangerous in ways I couldn't quite define. But I had a job to do. Morrison was counting on me to figure out what those climbers had really seen. So I checked my equipment one more time, made sure my headlamp was secure, and continued climbing toward the bridge approach. The clicking sounds got louder as I climbed higher, and they definitely weren't random. There was a pattern there, almost like Morse code or some kind of signal. But signal to what? From what? About 50 feet from the bridge itself, I found something that made me stop cold. Footprints in a patch of accumulated dirt and debris. But they weren't boot prints or shoe prints. They looked almost human, but wrong somehow. Too narrow, with what might have been claw marks where toes should be. And they were arranged in a line leading directly across the bridge, like something had walked from one side to the other. The prints were fresh. Recent enough that the edges were still sharp, the dirt still loose in places. Someone or something had crossed this bridge very recently, maybe while I was climbing up. That's when the fog started rolling in. It came from nowhere, just like Morrison had warned me it might. One minute I had clear visibility for hundreds of feet in every direction. The next, thick gray mist was pouring up from the gorge below and down from the peaks above, swallowing the landscape in minutes. The clicking sound stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence I heard footsteps on the bridge above me. The footsteps weren't human. They were too light for the size they suggested, and they had that same deliberate rhythm as the clicking sounds. Step, step, pause, step, step, pause. Whatever was walking across that bridge was taking its time, like it was in no hurry to get anywhere, or like it was waiting for something. The fog was getting thicker, reducing visibility to maybe 10 feet in any direction. I was effectively blind, hanging from a cliff face with something unknown moving around above me. Every wilderness survival instinct I'd ever learned was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I'm stubborn. That Scottish side of the family, Grandmother always said. Instead of retreating, I continued climbing toward the bridge. Maybe it was just another climber, someone who'd reached the arch ahead of me. The footprints could belong to someone wearing minimalist climbing shoes. The sounds could have a perfectly rational explanation. At least, that's what I told myself. The approach to the bridge required traversing a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for one person, with a sheer drop into the fog-shrouded gorge below. I'd done this traverse twice before, but never in conditions like this. I moved slowly, testing each handhold, placing protection every few moves in case I slipped. Halfway across the approach ledge, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Singing. It was coming from the direction of the bridge, drifting through the fog like smoke. Not words I could understand. It sounded like Cherokee, but Cherokee filtered through something that made it seem ancient and hollow. The melody was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like a funeral song for someone who wasn't quite dead. I stopped moving and listened. The voice was definitely not human. Too deep, too resonant, like it was coming from a chest cavity much larger than any person could have. And underneath the singing, I could hear other sounds, clicking, scraping, like bones moving against stone. That's when I saw the light. It was dim at first, just a pale glow filtering through the fog ahead of me. But as I watched, it got brighter, and I realized it was moving. Not like a flashlight or headlamp, but more like phosphorescence, cold, greenish-white light that seemed to come from the air itself. The singing stopped. The footsteps resumed, but now they were coming toward me. I pressed myself against the rock face, hoping the fog would hide me. Through the mist, I could see the light getting closer, and with it came a smell that made my stomach turn. Old bones, decay, something that had been dead for a very long time. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the bridge, maybe 20 feet from where I was frozen against the cliff. In the pale light, I could just make out a shape. Tall, impossibly thin, moving with joints that bent in directions human joints weren't meant to bend. It stood at the beginning of the arch like it was waiting for permission to cross, or like it was waiting for something else to arrive. My radio crackled again, and this time the voice coming through the static was clear enough to understand. "Turn back, granddaughter. This is not your crossing to make." I recognized that voice. It was my grandmother, who had been dead for 10 years. The thing on the bridge turned toward me. In the green-white glow, I caught a glimpse of what might have been a face, skeletal but not quite human. Eye sockets too large, jaw too long, with something that could have been antlers or branches growing from its skull. It raised one arm, too long, too thin, ending in fingers that were more like talons, and pointed directly at me. "Go home, Martha Crowfeather. Go home while you still can." The voice was coming from my radio, but I could see the thing's mouth moving in sync with the words. Somehow, impossibly, it was using my grandmother's voice to speak to me. That's when my nerve finally broke. I started moving back along the ledge, retreating as fast as I could while still maintaining safety protocols. Behind me, I could hear the thing following, not chasing exactly, but keeping pace. The footsteps maintained that same deliberate rhythm, and occasionally I would hear that terrible singing drifting through the fog. I was about halfway back to the main cliff face when my headlamp beam caught something that almost made me lose my grip entirely. There were more of them, shapes in the fog, moving with that same impossible gait. They were approaching from different directions, converging on the bridge from positions I hadn't even realized were accessible. How many were there? 5? 10? In the swirling mist, it was impossible to tell. And they were all singing now, harmonizing in that ancient Cherokee that seemed to come from somewhere much older than human language. The song was getting louder, more complex, like some kind of ceremony or ritual was building toward a climax. I reached the main wall and started rappelling as fast as I dared. Above me, the singing continued, and I could see multiple sources of that cold light moving around the bridge area. Whatever was happening up there, I didn't want to be anywhere near it. But as I descended, the fog followed me. It poured down the cliff face like liquid, swallowing handholds and obscuring the route below. My headlamp beam seemed to get absorbed by the mist, providing only a few feet of visibility in any direction. 200 feet down, my rope snagged on something. I tried to free it gently, then with more force, but it wouldn't budge. I was stuck, suspended in fog so thick I couldn't see the wall I was hanging against. That's when one of them appeared right next to me. It was hanging from the rock face like gravity didn't apply to it, positioned horizontally against the vertical stone. Up close, I could see that it wasn't quite skeleton and wasn't quite flesh. Something in between, like a person worms. Hull had been dead for months but was still moving around. Its eyes were hollow sockets filled with that same green-white light, and when it opened its mouth to speak, I could see that its teeth were too sharp and went too far back. "You climb in sacred places without permission, granddaughter. You walk paths meant for the dead. This brings consequences." My grandmother's voice, but coming from that horrible mouth. "I didn't know," I whispered. "I'll leave. I'll go back down." Knowledge and ignorance carry the same weight here. Actions have results regardless of intentions. The thing reached toward me with one of those impossibly long arms. Its fingers were like bone twigs, and where they touched my climbing harness, the metal began to corrode. Not rust, corrode, like it was being eaten by acid. But you carry the old blood, Cherokee blood, blood that once knew respect for crossing places. This creates possibilities. My harness was starting to come apart where the thing had touched it. If it failed completely, I'd fall 400 feet to the bottom of the gorge. "What do you want?" I asked. "A test. A crossing. If you can walk the bridge without falling, without fear, without turning back, then you may leave this place. If you cannot..." It gestured toward the fog-shrouded depths below us. "And if I refuse?" The thing smiled, revealing even more of those needle-sharp teeth. "Then you become part of the bridge, like the others who refused, like the others who failed." The choice wasn't really a choice at all. My harness was dissolving, my ropes were compromised, and I was surrounded by things that shouldn't exist, having a conversation that couldn't be happening. I could try to escape down a cliff face with failing equipment, or I could face whatever test was waiting for me on that bridge. "How do I know you'll keep your word?" I asked. The creature tilted its head at an angle that would have broken a human neck. "We are guardians, not deceivers. The bridge tests worthiness. Those who pass may go. Those who fail become part of the crossing." It gestured upward, and I followed its motion with my eyes. In the fog above us, I could see more shapes clinging to the rock face. They weren't moving like the active creatures. They were still, positioned at regular intervals along the cliff, like they'd been climbing when something stopped them, permanently. "The others who failed," I said. "The others who could not complete the crossing. Their bodies remain. Their spirits serve the bridge." With my equipment failing and no other options, I started climbing back up toward the arch. The creatures accompanied me, moving alongside the cliff face in ways that defied everything I knew about physics. They flowed across the stone like water, sometimes horizontal, sometimes inverted, always maintaining that same deliberate pace. As we climbed, the fog began to thin slightly, and I could see the bridge more clearly. It was exactly as I remembered from my previous visits, a natural arch of quartzite spanning a 400-foot gap. But now I could see things I'd missed before, or maybe things that hadn't been there before. The stone itself was covered in carvings. Not recent scratches like the claw marks I'd found earlier, but ancient symbols that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Cherokee pictographs mixed with designs I didn't recognize, all of them glowing faintly with that same cold light the creatures emanated. And along the sides of the bridge, at regular intervals, were bones, human bones, arranged in careful patterns like some kind of architectural decoration. Skulls marked the beginning and end of the arch, and femurs formed a kind of railing along the edges. The bones weren't old and weathered. They looked fresh, clean, like they'd been carefully maintained. "The failed crossings," said the creature that had been speaking with my grandmother's voice. "Their remains honor the bridge. Their spirits provide strength for the testing." I reached the approach ledge again and stood at the beginning of the arch. Up close, the bridge looked much longer than I remembered, easily 100 feet from one side to the other with no handholds or safety features, just smooth stone spanning empty air above a 400-foot drop. Walk across without stopping. Do not look down. Do not look back. Do not show fear. These are the rules of the crossing. What happens if I look down? Then you fall, and your bones join the bridge, and your spirit joins the guardians. And if I make it across? Then you leave this place and do not return, ever. I looked at the narrow span of stone ahead of me. No safety rope, no protection, just me, my balance, and whatever courage I could muster in a situation that had moved far beyond anything my ranger training had prepared me for. What about my equipment? My rope? Leave it. The bridge provides for those who serve it faithfully. I unclipped from my harness and left my gear at the beginning of the arch. The creatures arranged themselves along the sides of the bridge, watching with those hollow, light-filled eyes. Above us, the fog swirled in patterns that seemed almost intentional, like it was being directed by some intelligence. I took my first step onto the bridge. The stone felt solid under my feet, but it also felt alive somehow, like there was warmth and movement deep inside the rock. With each step, I could feel something responding, some presence that was aware of my progress across the span. 20 feet out, I heard the singing again, but now I could understand some of the words. Cherokee phrases my grandmother had taught me when I was little. Songs about journeys, about crossing from one world to another, about tests and transformations. 50 feet out, the wind picked up. Not natural wind. It came from below, rising up from the gorge with impossible force. It carried sounds with it, voices calling, hands clapping, drums beating, like their woo, as a whole community down there in the depths, celebrating something. 70 feet out, I made the mistake of glancing to my left. One of the creatures was walking beside me on empty air, matching my pace exactly. It wasn't standing on anything, just moving through space like the ground extended infinitely in all directions. When it saw me looking, it smiled with those terrible teeth. Do not lose focus, granddaughter. The crossing requires all your attention. I forced my eyes back to the stone ahead of me and kept walking. 80 feet, 90. The end of the bridge was getting closer, but it also seemed to be getting farther away, like the arch was stretching as I walked across it. That's when I heard my grandmother's real voice, not filtered through the creature's mouth, not distorted by radio static. Her actual voice, clear and strong, coming from somewhere ahead of me. Keep walking, Edota. You're almost home. And suddenly I could see her, standing at the far end of the bridge. She looked exactly as I remembered her from when I was 10 years old. Long gray hair in braids, wearing the traditional dress she saved for special occasions. She was holding out her hand toward me, smiling with genuine warmth. Grandmother? Keep walking, Martha. Don't stop now. But something was wrong. Grandmother was translucent, and that cold light was shining through her from behind. And when she smiled, her teeth were just a little too sharp. I stopped walking. You're not her, I said. The thing wearing my grandmother's appearance tilted its head. I am what I have always been, memory given form, love transformed by death. Does it matter what name you give me? She wouldn't want me to be here. She would want me to be safe. Safety is for those who refuse to grow. The crossing changes you, granddaughter, makes you more than you were. I looked around at the Cree, otters lining the bridge. In the shifting fog and strange light, I could see them more clearly now. They had been human once. I could recognize features, clothing styles from different time, periods. Cherokee faces mixed with European settlers, modern climbers mixed with ancient travelers. All of them transformed into something else, something that served the bridge and its purposes. You want me to become like them. I want you to become what you were always meant to be. Guardian, guide, bridge between worlds. And if I say no? The grandmother thing's smile faltered. Then you fall, and we begin again with someone else. I was still 70 feet from the end of the bridge, 30 feet from where I'd started, close enough to the middle that going back would be as dangerous as going forward. But I finally understood what was really happening. This isn't a test of courage, I said. It's recruitment. The bridge needs guardians, spirits who understand both worlds. Cherokee blood carries memory of the old ways. You would serve well. But I'd have to die first. You would have to change. Death is just another crossing. That's when I made my decision. Instead of continuing toward the false grandmother, I sat down in the middle of the bridge and refused to move. The creatures began making agitated clicking sounds. The fog swirled more violently around us. The wind from below became a howling gale that tried to push me off the arch. "You must complete the crossing," the grandmother thing called out. "You cannot remain in the middle." "Watch me," I said. I sat on that bridge for 6 hours. The creatures tried everything. They showed me visions of my past, my future, my deepest fears and greatest desires. They promised me power, knowledge, eternal life. They threatened me with death, madness, spiritual destruction. They used the voices of everyone I'd ever loved to try to convince me to stand up and complete the crossing, but I stayed put. Finally, as dawn began to break through the fog, the grandmother thing approached me one more time. "Why do you resist? The crossing would give you such purpose." "Because my grandmother, the real one, taught me something you obviously don't understand." "What is that?" "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay exactly where you are." The creature studied me with those hollow, light-filled eyes. Around us, the other guardians had gone silent, watching to see what would happen. "You would rather die here than serve the bridge?" "I'd rather live here than serve anything that lies to get recruits." The grandmother thing laughed, and for a moment it sounded almost human. "You have spine, granddaughter, more than most who attempt the crossing." "Does that mean I pass your test?" "It means you have created a new category. You are the first to refuse both crossing and falling." The fog began to dissipate as the sun climbed higher. In the growing light, I could see the bridge clearly for the first time since I'd started this nightmare. It was just stone again, ancient quartzite carved by water and time. The bones were gone, the carvings had faded, and the creatures had become translucent as shadows. So, what happens now? Now you leave, but you cannot speak of this place to others, and you cannot return. What about future climbers? What about people who don't know the rules? The grandmother thing smiled, and this time it looked genuinely fond. The bridge will test them as it has always done. Some will pass, some will fail. Some will sit down in the middle and refuse to play our game. And those last ones? Those ones usually become very good storytellers. I found myself back at the base of the Devil's Staircase with all my equipment intact and no memory of how I'd gotten there. My watch said it was 7 a.m. on September 17th. I'd lost 2 full days somehow. My radio was working again, full of worried messages from Morrison to Sking for status reports. I told him I'd had equipment problems and had to wait out weather. He seemed satisfied with that explanation. I never mentioned the creatures, the singing, or the test. What would have been the point? Either people would think I was crazy or they'd want to see the bridge for themselves. Instead, I put in for a transfer to a desk job and spent the next 15 years working visitor education programs. I became very good at talking people out of attempting dangerous climbs in remote areas, especially areas with histories of unexplained accidents and local folklore about spiritual guardians. But I kept tabs on the Bone Bridge. Over the years, there were occasional reports from climbers who'd made it up there. Strange lights, unusual sounds, fog patterns that didn't match weather conditions. A few people turned back without attempting the crossing, claiming the place felt wrong somehow. Others pushed forward and were never seen again. The Cherokee Cultural Center stopped calling Morrison about sacred site disturbances. Whatever had been testing people up there seemed satisfied with the arrangement. I never went back. Never even hiked in that section of the park again. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my house, I hear something that might be singing. Cherokee words carried on the air, voices harmonizing in ancient melodies about crossings and tests and the spaces between worlds. And I remember my grandmother's real voice, not the borrowed version the creature used, but her actual words from when I was young and stupid enough to think the world made sense. Some places are doorways, Adoda. Smart people don't go knocking on doors they can't close. She was right, of course. She usually was. The thing is, I never knocked on that door. I just refused to walk through it when something else tried to open it for me. Maybe that's why I'm still here, telling this story instead of singing in harmony with voices that no longer remember what it felt like to be human. Or maybe I'm exactly where I was always supposed to be, sitting in the middle, refusing to cross, keeping watch over a bridge between worlds that most people don't even know exists. Either way, if you're ever hiking in the old rag wilderness and you hear Cherokee singing carried on the wind, or if you see lights moving in patterns that don't match any constellation, take my advice. Turn around and go home. Some crossings aren't meant for the living, and whatever you do, don't sit down in the middle of the bridge. Because even though it worked for me, I'm not entirely sure I ever really left that place. Sometimes, when I look in mirrors, I can see a faint green-white glow behind my eyes, and my teeth seem just a little bit sharper than they used to be. But that might just be my imagination. I hope it's just my imagination. My name is Samuel Ironbark, and I've been guarding these mountains for 21 years now. People think that's a funny name for a forest ranger, but my daddy gave it to me long before I knew I'd spend my life among trees. He was a logger, and his daddy before him. Third generation of Ironbarks cutting down what took centuries to grow. But I'm different. I protect what my family destroyed. August 1975. Brought the worst drought I'd seen in 2 decades of service. The forest was dying of thirst, and I could hear it in every creak and groan as I walked my patrol routes through Pisgah National Forest. Trees that had survived the Cherokee removal, the Civil War, and the great chestnut blight were now dropping leaves in the middle of summer. That's why I was out on Rough Ridge that morning, 12 miles from the nearest fire road. My job was to check on the old chestnut grove, one of the last places in North Carolina where American chestnuts still grew tall. Most folks didn't know they existed. The blight had wiped out billions of trees 60 years ago, but these few giants had somehow held on. I'd been walking since dawn, my boots finding the familiar deer paths through the understory. The air was thick and still, not a breath of wind to cool the sweat on my neck. Even the birds were quiet, always a bad sign in the woods. When nature goes silent, something's wrong. The communication tower on Bald Rock had been hit by lightning 3 days prior, so I was completely cut off. No radio contact, no way to call for backup if something went wrong. But I'd been working these mountains alone for years. Isolation didn't bother me anymore. What bothered me was the smell. It started subtle, just a sweet, rotten scent mixing with the normal forest odors of moss and decomposing leaves. But as I climbed higher toward the chestnut grove, the smell got stronger. Sickly sweet, like flow. Air's left too long in a vase. I knew that smell. It was the scent of dying trees. My grandfather used to tell stories about these mountains when I was small. He'd lean back in his rocking chair and speak of spirits that lived in the old trees, protectors that would strike down anyone who harmed the forest. Bark peelers, he called them, because they could strip the life from a tree faster than any disease. I'd always figured those stories were just old-timers' way of explaining plant diseases and forest die-offs. Cherokee folklore mixed with logging guilt, nothing more. My family had cut down thousands of trees over the decades. If tree spirits were real, they would have come for us long ago. But walking up that ridge in the August heat, smelling death in the air, and hearing nothing but my own footsteps, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: fear. The path curved around a massive boulder, and suddenly I could see the chestnut grove spread out below me. 7 ancient trees, each one over 100 feet tall and 4 feet thick at the base. They were the last of their kind in these mountains, survivors of a plague that had wiped out their entire species across the eastern United States. And every single one of them was dying. Long strips of bark hung from their trunks like peeling skin. The exposed wood underneath was pale and wet, weeping clear sap that caught the morning sunlight. It looked like the trees had been tortured, systematically skinned while still alive. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the bark had been removed in perfect spirals, as if something had carefully unwound each tree like a spool of thread. No disease caused that kind of damage. No insect could create such precise patterns. I dropped my pack and pulled out my field notebook, hands shaking slightly as I sketched what I was seeing. In 21 years of Forest C. Arvis, I documented beetle infestations, fungal blights, storm damage, and drought stress. But this was something new, something impossible. I spent the morning taking photographs and collecting samples, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The spiral patterns were identical on each tree, starting at the base and winding upward in a clockwise direction, with each strip of bark exactly 3 inches wide. Too precise for any natural cause. The exposed cambium layer was still alive, which meant the damage was recent, maybe within the last few days. But I'd been monitoring this grove for months, and the trees had been healthy just a week ago. Around noon, I set up my camp about 50 yards from the grove. The smell was overwhelming up close, so I positioned my tent upwind and tried to eat lunch. The silence was getting to me. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. That's when I heard the sound. A soft scraping, like fingernails on bark. Rhythmic and purposeful, coming from somewhere deeper in the grove. I grabbed my binoculars and crept closer, moving from tree to tree and staying low. The scraping continued. Scritch, 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 always just ahead of me, always just out of sight. Then I saw her. At first I thought it was just another tree trunk. The figure was tall and thin, maybe 7 feet from head to toe, and her skin had the gray-brown texture of bark. She was kneeling at the base of one of the chestnuts, her long fingers working at the tree's surface, peeling away the bark in perfect spirals. I watched through my binoculars, frozen in place. Her movements were fluid and careful, like a surgeon removing bandages from a wound. Each strip of bark came away cleanly, exposing the pale wood beneath. She would peel for a few seconds, then pause and lean close to the tree, almost like she was listening to something. My rational mind was screaming that this couldn't be real. Heat exhaustion, maybe. Dehydration. 21 years in the forest, and I had never seen anything like this. People don't live in trees. They don't have bark for skin. But I kept watching. The figure moved around the tree trunk, always keeping her back to me, always working with those same precise movements. The scraping sound continued, soft and methodical. She was killing the tree slowly, carefully, like it was some kind of ritual. I tried to back away quietly, but my boot caught on a fallen branch. The dry wood snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The scraping stopped. Slowly, impossibly, the figure's head turned toward me. She kept kneeling at the base of the tree, but her head rotated almost completely around, owl-like. Her face was smooth bark with deep grooves where features should be. No eyes, no mouth, just the weathered surface of very old wood. But somehow I knew she could see me. We stayed frozen like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then she stood up, still facing me with that terrible blank face, and I could see that her fingers ended in sharp points like thorns. Her mouth opened, a crack in the bark that split horizontally across her face, and she made a sound like wind through dead leaves. Not quite words, but I understood the meaning. Leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran back to my campsite, grabbed my pack without bothering to take down the tent, and started hiking toward the fire road as fast as I could move through the underbrush. But even as I ran, I could hear that scraping sound echoing through the forest behind me. Scritch, scritch, scritch. And underneath it, something that might have been laughter, or might have been crying. The sound of the forest dying. I made it about 2 miles before I had to stop. My chest was burning and my legs were shaking from the sprint down the ridge. I leaned against an oak tree, gasping for breath, and tried to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real. Heat hallucination. That had to be it. The drought, the isolation, the stress of seeing those magnificent chestnuts dying. My mind had created something to explain the impossible. There were no bark people living in the forest. There couldn't be. But when I looked back up the ridge, I could see movement in the trees. At first, it was just shadows shifting in the canopy, nothing more unusual than squirrels or birds. But as I watched, The shadows began to take shape. Tall, thin figures moving from trunk to trunk, never quite visible but always there at the edge of my vision. They were following me. I forced myself to walk instead of run, trying to stay calm and think rationally. The fire road was still 8 miles away, and panic would only get me lost or injured. But every few minutes I would hear that scraping sound from somewhere behind me, and I'd have to fight the urge to break into a sprint again. The forest was changing around me. Trees that should have been healthy showed fresh spiral scars. Bark strips littered the trail, curling up in the heat like old paper, and the smell of dying sap was getting stronger, following me downhill like a poisonous fog. By late afternoon, I was starting to see them clearly. There were at least a dozen, maybe more. They moved through the forest like part of it, stepping from shadow to shadow, always staying just far enough away that I couldn't make out details. But I could see their basic shape: tall, thin, humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too many joints in their arms and legs, heads that moved independently of their bodies. And they were hurting me. Every time I tried to take a shortcut or move off the main trail, one of them would appear ahead of me, standing motionless between the trees. Not threatening exactly, but blocking my path. They wanted me to go a specific direction, and that direction wasn't toward the fire road. As the sun started to set, I found myself in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. The trees were older here, more massive. Some of them had to be over 300 years. Old, ancient hardwoods that had somehow escaped the loggers and the developers. Their trunks were so wide that 3 men holding hands couldn't circle them, and every single one showed signs of the bark peeler's work. Spiral scars wound around the giants like permanent wounds, but these weren't fresh like the ones on the chestnuts. These scars were old, grown over with new bark, healed but never forgotten. Some trees had multiple spirals, layer upon layer of old damage. I was looking at decades of activity, maybe centuries. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with a new problem. This had been going on for a very long time. The bark peelers had been living in these mountains since before my grandfather was born, maybe since before the Cherokee were forced to leave. And now they were angry about something. The scraping sounds were coming from all around me now, echoing off the massive tree trunks. I couldn't see the figures anymore, but I could feel them watching. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, hidden in the shadows of the ancient forest. I stumbled into a small clearing and stopped. In the center was a ring of dead trees, not cut down but killed by bark removal. Their naked trunks stood like pale monuments, completely stripped of their outer layer. And arranged around the base of each dead tree were objects I recognized. Surveyor's stakes, bright orange plastic markers that land developers use to mark property boundaries. Someone had been planning to cut down this forest. These ancient giants, these last survivors of America's original wilderness, had been marked for destruction, and the bark peelers had killed the marked trees first, as a warning or a promise. The scraping sounds stopped all at once, plunging the forest into absolute silence. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the clearing, came a voice like wind through empty branches. Samuel Ironbaugh, Orcano third generation, tree killer's son. I spun around but saw nothing except shadows. Who's there? What do you want? We want what was taken. We want what was promised. We want the sickness to end. What sickness? I'm trying to help the forest. I'm not like my father and grandfather. The blight, the dying, the forgetting. The voice seemed to come from every direction at once. You carry the knowledge. You must choose. Choose what? But there was no answer. The forest stayed silent as I called out questions into the darkness. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to light my flashlight and examine the dead trees more closely. Each one had been killed the same way, the bark removed in perfect spirals until the tree could no longer transport nutrients from its roots to its leaves. But carved into the exposed wood of each trunk, I found symbols I'd never seen before. Not Cherokee, not English, but something older. Primitive drawings that looked like trees and human figures and spiraling patterns. And at the base of the largest dead tree, I found something that made my blood run cold. A ranger's badge, tarnished and old, with a name I recognized. Thomas Whitaker, my predecessor. The ranger who had worked this section before me, who had supposedly transferred to another forest in 1954. The ranger who had never been seen again after his last patrol. I spent that night in the clearing, afraid to sleep, but too exhausted to keep moving. Every time I started to doze, I'd hear the scraping sounds starting up again somewhere in the darkness. They were still out there, watching and waiting. When dawn finally came, I was no longer alone in the clearing. She was sitting across from me, maybe 20 feet away, as still as a tree stump. The same figure I'd seen at the chestnut grove, but now I could see her more clearly in the morning light. Her bark-like skin was scarred with spiral patterns, and her thorn-tipped fingers were stained with tree sap. But it was her face that held my attention. It wasn't completely blank like I'd thought. There were features there, barely visible, the suggestion of eyes, the hint of a mouth, and in those almost eyes, I saw something that looked like terrible sadness. "You stayed," she said in that wind-through-leaves voice. "I want to understand," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "What are you? What do you want from me?" She tilted her head, and for a moment she looked almost human. "We are what remains, the last guardians of the first forest. We have watched your kind cut and burn and poison for 200 years. We have tried to heal what you destroy. The bark removal. You're not killing the trees. You're trying to save them. The sickness runs deep. In the wood, in the sap, in the very roots. We must strip away the infected bark before it can spread. Some trees can be healed. Others..." She gestured toward the ring of dead giants. "Others carry too much poison." I thought about the chestnut grove, about the blight that had killed millions of American chestnuts decades ago. "You're trying to cure the blight. We are trying to cure all the sicknesses your kind brought to the forest. The blight was only the beginning. Now there is acid in the rain, poison in the soil, machines that cut faster than trees can grow." She stood up, and I could see that she was even taller than I'd estimated, close to 8 feet, with limbs that seemed to stretch like branches reaching for sunlight. "We saved what we could, healed what could be healed, but the sickness spreads faster now. We cannot keep up." Her voice was full of ancient exhaustion. "So we decided to remove the source." "The source?" "Your kind, the tree killers, the forest burners, all of you." Other figures began emerging from the shadows around the clearing. Dozens of them, maybe more, all tall and bark-skinned and impossibly graceful. Some carried weapons made from sharpened wood. Others had hands that ended in claws instead of thorn fingers. But they weren't moving to attack. They were waiting. "Thomas Whitaker," I said, remembering the badge I'd found. "What happened to him?" "He chose." She pointed to one of the dead trees, and I saw that the spiral carving was different from the others, more detailed, more intentional. He understood what must be done. He became part of the healing. The tree she indicated was the largest in the clearing, its naked trunk pale and smooth, and carved deep into its surface was the story of a man who had loved the forest so much that he'd given up his human form to protect it. "You want me to choose the same thing. You carry the knowledge of tree sickness. You understand the forest in ways others do not. You could help us heal what remains, cure what can still be saved. But you must give up the form that destroys, to take the form that preserves." I looked around at the circle of bark peelers, at the dead trees that had once been humans, at the ancient forest that was slowly dying despite their efforts. And I understood what they were offering. Immortality, of a sort. The chance to spend eternity protecting the wilderness I'd devoted my life to serving. But at the cost of everything that made me human. And if I refuse? Then you join the sickness that must be removed. The choice was simple and terrible. Become one of them, or die as one of the tree killers they'd sworn to eliminate. But as I stood there in that circle of ancient power, I realized there might be a third option. What if I could help you without changing? What if there was another way to heal the forest? Her bark-carved features shifted into what might have been hope. Speak. The land developers, the ones who put out those surveyor stakes, they're planning to clear-cut this entire section. If you kill me, you'll have removed one person who was trying to protect the forest. But there will be hundreds more coming with chainsaws and bulldozers. The circle of bark peelers began to murmur among themselves in their wind-voice language. But if you let me leave, I continued, I can stop them. I know the system, the laws, the people who make decisions about public land. I can get this area designated as protected wilderness. No cutting, no development, no more poison. And the blight, the sickness in the trees. I thought about the research I'd been reading, the experimental treatments being developed by forest scientists. I can bring healers, human healers who understand tree diseases. We can work together, your ancient knowledge combined with new medicine. The figure who had been speaking for the others stepped closer. You would do this? Abandon your own kind to serve the forest? I've been serving the forest for 21 years, I said. I'm not abandoning anything. I'm just asking you to let me serve it as a human instead of as a tree. She was quiet for a long time, looking at me with those almost eyes. Around us, the other bark peelers waited in perfect stillness. Finally, she nodded. You will have one season, one growing cycle to prove that your words are true. If the cutting stops, if the healing begins, then you may continue as you are. But if the forest continues to die, then I'll take Thomas Whitaker's choice. Yes. The circle began to dissolve as the bark peelers melted back into the shadows of the forest. Soon, only the speaker remained. One season, Samuel Ironbark, do not fail us. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the clearing with the dead trees and the weight of an impossible promise. It took me 2 days to hike back to the ranger station. When I finally stumbled out of the forest, dehydrated and half delirious, my supervisor wanted to send me to the hospital, but I had work to do. I spent the next week on the phone with every contact I had in the Forest Service, the EPA, and the State Environmental Agency. I filed emergency reports about the chestnut grove, documenting it as a rare ecosystem that needed immediate protection. I called in favors from botanists and forestry professors, getting them to visit the site and witness the ancient trees for themselves. The land development company fought me at every step, but I had 21 years of bureaucratic experience on my side. I knew which forms to file, which regulations to cite, which politicians cared about environmental protection. By October, I had a temporary injunction stopping all development in the Rough Ridge area. By Christmas, the entire section was designated as protected wilderness. But that was just the beginning. I started bringing researchers to the forest, plant pathologists who specialized in tree diseases, mycologists who understood fungal infections, geneticists who were working on blight-resistant chestnuts. At first, they were skeptical about working with local folklore and traditional forest management. Then they started seeing results. The spiral bark removal technique, it turned out, was incredibly effective at stopping the spread of certain tree diseases. The precise pattern allowed infected tissue to be removed while preserving the tree's ability to transport nutrients. Several universities are now studying the method for use in managing forest health. The chestnut grove survived. More than that, it began to thrive. New growth appeared where the bark had been carefully removed, and for the first time in decades, the trees produced a full crop of nuts. I still patrol those mountains, though I'm officially retired now. At 67, I move slower than I used to, but I know every trail and every tree in my section of the forest. And sometimes, on very quiet mornings, I see the bark peelers at work. They don't hide from me anymore. I'll be checking on a diseased oak or a storm-damaged pine, and I'll look up to find one of them working nearby. We nod to each other like colleagues, which I suppose we are. They've taught me things about forest health that aren't in any textbook, and I've helped them understand which trees can be saved and which ones need to be let go. The The partnership isn't perfect. We've lost some trees that might have been savable, and we've spent time on others that were too far gone. But the forest is healthier now than it's been in my lifetime. The bird populations are recovering, the streams are running clearer, and new growth is filling in areas that were damaged by decades of poor management. Sometimes tourists ask me about the spiral scars they see on certain trees. I tell them it's an old Cherokee healing technique that we've started using again. That's not entirely untrue. The bark peelers keep to the deep forest mostly, far from the hiking trails and camping areas. But they're always there, watching and working and protecting what remains of America's original wilderness. They remember when these mountains were covered in massive chestnuts, when wolves and elk roamed the ridges, when the forest was so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. And they remember every tree that's been cut down, every stream that's been poisoned, every species that's been driven away. I think about Thomas Whitaker sometimes, about the choice he made in that clearing 40 years ago. I understand it better now. The temptation to give up human limitations, to become something that could truly protect the forest from all the ways we damage it. But I made a different choice, and it's worked out, mostly. The Land Development Company still sends lawyers to challenge the wilderness designation every few years. Politicians talk about opening protected areas to logging and mining. Climate change is bringing new diseases and pests that threaten even the healthiest trees. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the deep woods, I hear the bark peelers calling to each other in their wind voice language. The tone has changed over the years. Less angry now, but also more urgent. They know something I don't, something about what's coming. The season they gave me to prove myself has turned into decades, but I'm not sure how much more time we have. The forest is healthier, yes, but the world around it keeps getting sicker. And there are more surveyor stakes appearing on the boundaries of protected land, more politicians who think ancient trees are less important than quarterly profits. I'm training a replacement, a young botanist who understands both the science and the mystery of forest management. She's seen the bark peelers at work, and she's not afraid. That's important. Fear makes people do stupid things in the wilderness. But late at night, when the wind is moving through the trees in just the right way, I sometimes hear voices that sound like my grandfather's stories. Old voices, patient voices, telling me that the choice Thomas Whitaker made is still available. The trees would welcome me, they whisper. The forest needs guardians who understand both worlds, human and wild, temporary and eternal. I could help them heal the deep sicknesses, the ones that go beyond fungal infections and insect damage. I could help them heal the sickness of forgetting what we used to be, before we decided that wilderness was something to be conquered instead of something to be part of. I haven't made that choice yet. But someday, when I'm too old to hike these ridges and too tired to fight the endless battles against development and destruction, I think I might walk up to that clearing where the dead trees stand like monuments. And I might let the bark peelers teach me their final lesson about what it means to truly serve the forest. The choice will still be there, waiting in the spiral shadows of the ancient trees. After all, some promises are meant to be kept across generations. My name is David Colehart, and I've been a forest ranger for 12 years. I'm telling you this story because I need someone to know what really happened in those mines back in February 1977. Most folks won't believe me, but I swear on my father's grave that every word is true. I grew up in these West Virginia hills. My daddy and granddaddy both worked the coal mines before the big companies stripped most of the land bare and moved on. Left us with nothing but poisoned streams and holes in the ground. That's why I became a ranger. Figured I could help heal what the mining had broken. The Jefferson National Forest covers thousands of acres of old mining country. My job was to keep people away from the dangerous abandoned shafts and test the air for methane gas. Those old mines are like sleeping monsters. One spark, and the whole mountainside can blow sky high. It was the coldest February I'd ever seen. Ice covered everything like a thick glass shell. The roads were so bad that I'd been stuck at the ranger station for 3 days, living on canned beans and instant coffee. But I had to check the mine sites. Heavy rain the week before might have flooded the lower shafts, and flooding meant dangerous gas buildup. I loaded my truck with gas detectors, rope, and emergency flares. The drive to the old Black Rock mine took 2 hours on roads that were more ice than asphalt. Twice I had to get out and chip ice from my windshield wipers. The radio crackled with static, no signal this deep in the mountains. Black Rock was the worst of the abandoned sites. Back in 1902, an explosion killed 73 miners. They never got all the bodies out before the mine flooded. The company just sealed it up and walked away, leaving families with nothing. Now the Forest Service owned the land, but you couldn't pay people to come up here after dark. I parked near the main shaft entrance and checked my equipment. The gas detector beeped steady, normal levels for now, but something felt wrong. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, not even the sound of ice melting. Just dead silence. The mine entrance was a black hole in the hillside, surrounded by rotting timber supports. Warning signs covered the old steel door, but someone had cut the chain. Fresh bolt cutters by the look of it. I cursed under my breath. Kids, probably. Looking for a place to party or explore. I'd have to go in and make sure they weren't trapped. I clicked on my headlamp and pushed through the door. The beam cut through darkness thick as velvet. The main tunnel stretched ahead, water dripping somewhere in the distance. My breath came out in white puffs. It was warmer inside than outside, but not by much. "Hello," I called out. "Forest Service. Anyone in here?" My voice echoed back from the depths, distorted and strange. I checked my gas detector again. Still normal. But something made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the smell. Not just the usual mine odor of damp rock and rust, but something else. Something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long on a grave. I walked deeper into the mine, my boots splashing through shallow puddles. The tunnel branched off in 3 directions. I'd been in here before, but never alone, never in weather like this. Emergency protocol said I should radio my location, but my radio was just static this deep underground. That's when I saw the first sign that something was very wrong. On the tunnel wall, someone had scratched marks in the stone. Not random scratches, deliberate marks, like a calendar. 73 marks, arranged in groups of 7. I ran my flashlight over them. The scratches looked old, worn smooth by decades of water, but they caught my light like they were made of something that glowed. I told myself it was just minerals in the rock. Iron ore, maybe, or coal dust mixed with limestone. But my hands were shaking as I took photos for my report. I'd never seen anything like those marks before. A sound echoed from deeper in the mine, not dripping water or settling timbers. It sounded almost like singing, low voices humming an old tune I half remembered from church. But that was impossible. Nobody else was down here, nobody living anyway. I should have left then, should have marked the entrance as hazardous and called for backup in the morning. But those marks on the wall bothered me, and the thought that someone might be hurt or trapped kept me moving forward. The singing got clearer as I walked deeper into the mine. It was definitely voices, men's voices, harmonizing like they were singing in a church choir. The tune was Amazing Grace, but slower and sadder than I'd ever heard it sung. The kind of slow, mournful singing you'd hear at a funeral. My gas detector started clicking faster. Not dangerous yet, but getting higher. I should turn back, but the singing was coming from the direction of the main chamber, where the explosion had happened 75 years ago. If someone was down there, they were in the most dangerous part of the mine. "Hello?" I called again. "I'm a ranger. Can you hear me?" The singing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. It pressed against my eardrums like I was underwater. Even my footsteps seemed too loud. I kept walking, but every instinct screamed at me to run. That's when I saw the light. Not the steady white beam of a flashlight or the yellow flicker of candles. This light was blue-green, like the glow of foxfire on rotting logs, but brighter. It pulsed like a heartbeat coming from the main chamber ahead. I checked my gas detector. The clicking was faster now, almost a steady beep. Still not in the red zone, but close. Methane gas glows when it burns, but methane burns orange, not blue-green. This was something else. I reached the entrance to the main chamber and stopped dead. The room was huge, maybe 50 feet across, less than 30 feet high. Mining equipment from the 1902 disaster still lay scattered on the floor, rusted pickaxes, overturned ore cars, broken timber supports. But that's not what made my blood freeze. The chamber was full of men. They stood in groups of 3 and 4, maybe 20 or 30 of them total, all wearing the same clothes, canvas work pants, flannel shirts, suspenders, the kind of mining helmets with carbide lamps that they used in 1902. Their faces were pale as milk, and they glowed with that same blue-green light. They were looking right at me. I blinked hard, shook my head, looked again. Still there, still watching me with eyes that reflected my headlamp beam like mirrors. None of them moved. None of them breathed. They just stood there among the rusted mining equipment like they were waiting for their shift to start. My gas detector was beeping steady now. I needed to get out of here before the methane levels got deadly. But I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. Those glowing men held me frozen with their stare. One of them stepped forward. He was tall and thin, with a beard that came down to his chest. The lamp on his helmet cast no light, but he glowed from inside like he'd swallowed fireflies. When he opened his mouth to speak, his voice sounded like wind through broken glass. "You shouldn't be here, boy. I'm a forest ranger," I stammered. "I'm checking for gas leaks." He smiled, and his teeth gleamed like pearls. "Gas leaks. Yes, we know about gas leaks." He gestured to the other men. "We've been waiting here since 1902, waiting for someone to pay for what happened to us." That's when I noticed the wounds. Not all of them were whole. Some had burns on their faces and hands. Others were missing arms or legs. A few were barely more than shadows, torn apart by the explosion that killed them. "The company knew," the tall man continued. "Knew the methane was building up. Knew the ventilation system was broken. But they made us work anyway. 73 good men died because they cared more about coal than about our lives." Detector was beeping fast now, almost continuous. The methane levels were climbing toward dangerous, but I couldn't run. These weren't hallucinations caused by gas poisoning. They were too real, too detailed. I could smell the coal dust on their clothes, see the individual whiskers in their beards. "What do you want?" I whispered. "Justice," said another voice. A younger man, maybe 20, with half his face burned away. "We want the company to pay for what they did to us." "The company's been gone for 50 years, I said. "All those men are dead." "But their sons aren't," the tall man said. "Their grandsons aren't. The families that got rich off our deaths are still alive, still rich, still don't care about the men they killed." The temperature in the chamber dropped 10 degrees in a second. My breath came out in thick white puffs. Ice began forming on the walls, crackling as it spread across the stone. "We've been waiting for someone who could help us," the tall man said. "Someone who understands what the mines took from these mountains. Someone whose family paid the price, just like ours did." He knew. Somehow he knew about my father, my grandfather, all the coal-heart men who'd given their lives to these mountains. But how could he know? "Your family worked the mines for 3 generations," he continued. "Your great-grandfather died in a cave-in in 1923. Your grandfather got black lung from breathing coal dust for 30 years. Your father worked until his body gave out, then got nothing but a $20 pension and a burial plot." Everything he said was true, but I'd never told anyone those stories. Hell, most of the records had been lost when the company offices burned down in 1945. "How do you know all this?" I asked. "The dead remember everything," he said. "Every slight, every injustice, every family destroyed by the company's greed. We remember it all." My gas detector was screaming now, a steady, high-pitched whine. The methane levels were approaching explosive. One spark from my flashlight or the detector itself and the whole chamber would go up like a bomb. "I have to get out of here," I said, backing toward the tunnel entrance. "The gas levels are too high." "Yes," the tall man said. "Gas levels. Funny how that works, isn't it? How gas can build up so quickly when the ventilation fails. How one little spark can kill so many men." The blue-green glow around the figures began to pulse faster, brighter. The temperature kept dropping. My headlamp beam flickered, dimmed, almost went out. "We can control it now," the young man with the burned face said. "The gas, the pressure, the temperature. Death taught us things the living don't understand." I turned and ran. My boots splashed through puddles and slipped on ice as I sprinted back through the tunnel. Behind me, I could hear them singing again. That same slow, mournful version of Amazing Grace. But now it sounded less like a hymn and more like a war song. The tunnel seemed longer than before, the darkness thicker. My headlamp kept flickering, and twice I had to stop and smack it to get the light back. My gas detector was still screaming, which meant the methane was following me, spreading through the mine like invisible death. I reached the entrance and burst out into the cold February air. Never had ice and snow felt so good. I ran to my truck, threw my equipment in the back, and started the engine. The radio crackled to life as I got clear of the mine. "Ranger Station, this is Colehart. Do you copy?" "David, thank God. We've been trying to reach you for hours. What's your status?" I looked back at the mine entrance. The steel door stood open, but there was no blue-green glow, no singing, nothing but darkness. "I need to report a gas leak at Black Rock Mine," I said. "Dangerous levels throughout the main shaft. Recommend immediate closure and hazmat response." "Copy that. Any casualties?" I almost said yes, almost told them about the 73 men I'd seen standing in that chamber. But who would believe me? "No casualties," I said, "but seal that mine tight. Nobody goes in until we get proper ventilation equipment." I drove back to the ranger station as fast as the icy roads would allow. But even with the heater running full blast, I couldn't get warm. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing faces watching me from the darkness. That should have been the end of it. File a report, seal the mine, forget what I'd seen. But the dead don't give up easily. And they weren't done with me yet. 3 days later, the nightmares started. I'd dream I was back in that chamber, surrounded by glowing men with burned faces and missing limbs. They'd stand there singing while the methane levels climbed higher and higher. In the dreams, I couldn't run, couldn't move, could only watch as they moved closer, their blue-green light getting brighter, until I woke up screaming. My wife Sarah thought I was getting sick. "You look terrible," she said over breakfast. "Maybe you should take some time off." But I couldn't tell her what I'd seen. Couldn't tell anyone. I filed my report with careful, clinical language. Methane buildup due to ventilation failure and recommend immediate closure pending safety assessment. Nothing about glowing miners or voices in the darkness. The county sent a hazmat team to seal the mine entrance. I watched from half a mile away as they welded steel plates over the door and posted new warning signs. But somehow I knew it wouldn't matter. Steel and concrete couldn't keep the dead contained. That night I got a call from Tom Bradley, another ranger who worked the southern section of the forest. His voice was shaky, scared. "David, I need you to come out here. Something's happened at the Millerville mine." Millerville was 12 miles from Black Rock, another sealed-up disaster site from the early 1900s. I'd driven out there in a snowstorm, following Tom's truck down roads that were more ice than asphalt. I found Tom standing at the mine entrance with his flashlight in one hand and his radio in the other. He looked pale as a ghost. "The seal's been broken," he said, pointing to the steel door. Someone had cut through the metal like it was paper, leaving edges so smooth they looked melted. "Kids again?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "Look at the cuts, David. What kind of tool makes cuts like that? And feel this." He put his hand near the opening. "It's warm. Metal this thick would take hours to cut, even with industrial equipment. But there's no equipment up here, no tire tracks, no footprints, nothing." I checked my gas detector. Normal levels. But the air coming out of the mine had that same sweet, rotten smell I'd noticed at Black Rock. "I went in about 20 feet, Tom said. "Found something you need to see." We entered the mine together, our headlamps cutting twin beams through the darkness. The tunnel was smaller than Black Rock's, barely wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side. Water dripped from the ceiling, and our boots crunched on broken glass. "There," Tom said, pointing to the wall. More scratches in the stone. But these weren't calendar marks. These were letters, carved deep into the rock. Remember us. That wasn't here yesterday, Tom said. I've been in this mine a dozen times. Those marks are new. I ran my fingers over the letters. The stone was still warm, like someone had just finished carving. But the marks looked old, weathered, like they'd been there for decades. There's more, Tom said. We walked deeper into the mine. Every 50 feet, we found new messages carved in the walls. Justice delayed. They knew. 73 souls. Each one was warm to the touch. Each one looked both new and ancient. In the main chamber, we found Wassa, that was left of the Millerville crew. 32 miners had died here in 1908 when a methane explosion brought down half the mountain. Their equipment was still scattered on the floor. Rusted, tools, collapsed timber supports, ore cars overturned by the blast. But now there was something else. In the center of the chamber, someone had arranged 32 mining helmets in a perfect circle. The old carbide lamps were all lit, burning with that same blue-green flame I'd seen at Black Rock. Jesus Christ, Tom whispered. Those lamps haven't worked in 70 years. I walked closer to the circle of helmets. My gas detector was clicking faster now, but not dangerous yet. The flames danced without heat, casting weird shadows on the walls. We need to get out of here, I said. But Tom wasn't listening. He was staring at something behind me, his face white with terror. I turned around. The miners were back. Not just the tall man with the beard from Black Rock. All of them. 73 from the first mine, 32 from this one, over 100 glowing figures filling the chamber. They stood in groups according to how they died. The burned ones together, the crushed ones together, the ones torn apart by explosions. The tall man stepped forward. His blue-green glow was brighter than before. Angry. You sealed our mine, he said. I had to, I replied. The methane levels were dangerous. Dangerous. He laughed, and the sound was like wind through a graveyard. You think steel plates can keep us contained? You think we need tunnels and shafts to move through these mountains? The other miners began to sing again, that same slow version of Amazing Grace. But now their voices were louder, angrier, and the words were different. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. That saved a wretch like me. We once were lost, but now are found. We're blind, but now we see. The company knew, but did not care. They sent us to our death. Now we will make the guilty pay. Until we have no breath. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Ice formed on the wall, so on our clothes, on our breath. The carbide flames in the helmet circle flared higher, brighter. What do you want from me? I asked. Help, said the young man with the burned face. You understand what the mines took from these mountains. You know the price families like yours have paid. We've been waiting for someone who could reach the living world, the tall man added. Someone who could tell our story. Make them remember what happened here. I can't bring back the dead, I said. I can't undo what happened in 1902 or 1908. But you can make them pay, said another voice. A woman this time. I hadn't noticed her before. She wore a long dress and apron, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Sarah Millerville. My husband and 3 sons died in this mine. The company promised safety equipment, better ventilation, lied about everything. More voices joined in, telling stories of families destroyed, promises broken, lives thrown away for profit. Each story made the blue-green glow brighter, the temperature colder. The Ashford family owns half the county now, the tall man said. Built their fortune on our bones. 3 generations of wealth bought with our blood. I knew the Ashfords. Everyone in West Virginia knew them. They owned coal companies, timber rights, political influence, old money going back to the early mining days. James Ashford III lives in Charleston now, the woman continued. Big house, fancy cars, sends his children to private schools, never thinks about the families his great-grandfather destroyed. My gas detector was beeping steadily now. The methane was building again, just like at Black Rock. But this time I understood. They were controlling it. The dead miners could manipulate the gas, the pressure, the temperature. They were weaponizing their own deaths. "You want me to confront James Ashford?" I asked. "Tell him his family owes a debt to dead miners?" "We want justice," the tall man said simply. 105 men died because companies chose profit over safety. Those companies are gone, but their money lives on. Their families prosper while ours are forgotten. The singing grew louder, more voices joining the chorus. I could see new figures materializing at the edges of the chamber. Miners from other disasters, other sealed mines throughout the mountains. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all singing the same angry hymn. Tom grabbed my arm. "We have to go, now." But the miners had surrounded us. There was no path to the tunnel entrance. They stood there glowing, singing, waiting for my answer. "What if I say no?" I asked. The tall man smiled, and his teeth gleamed like ice. "Then you'll join us, you and your friend, and we'll keep asking until someone says yes." The methane detector was screaming now. One spark, and the whole chamber would explode, just like 1902 and 1908. We'd become part of their army, another set of voices demanding justice for the dead. "I need time to think," I said. "Time is something we have plenty of," the woman said. "The living, not so much." The blue-green glow began to fade, but not disappear. The miners stepped back, creating a narrow path to the tunnel. "1 week," the tall man said. "Then we'll come for you, whether you help us or not." Tom and I ran for the entrance, our gas detectors screaming warnings. Behind us, the singing continued, not fading as we got farther away, but following us through the tunnels, echoing off the walls like the mountain itself was humming their angry hymn. We burst out into the cold night air and kept running until we reached our trucks. Tom was shaking so hard he could barely hold his keys. "What the hell was that?" he asked. "Trouble," I said. "Big trouble." I looked back at the mine entrance. The blue-green glow was still visible through the opening, pulsing like a heartbeat. And I could still hear the singing, faint but clear, carrying on the winter wind. 1 week. 7 days to decide whether to help an army of dead miners get revenge on the families that killed them. 7 days to choose between the living and the dead. I had a feeling it was going to be the longest week of my life. I spent 3 days researching the Ashford family, digging through old newspapers and county records. What I found made my stomach turn. The Ashfords hadn't just owned the mines where the disasters happened. They'd deliberately cut safety measures to increase profits. Internal company memos from 1901 showed they knew about methane buildup at Blackrock, but decided the cost of fixing ventilation was excessive. A letter from 1907 revealed they'd removed safety equipment from Millerville to save money, calling the miners' complaints about gas levels hysterical. In both cases, they'd covered up evidence, bribed officials, and threatened families who tried to sue. The mining disasters that killed over 100 men weren't accidents. They were murders committed for money. By Thursday night, I'd made my decision. But when I picked up the phone to call James Ashford III, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely dial. "Ashford residence," said a woman's voice. "I need to speak with James Ashford. This is about the mining disasters in Jefferson County." A pause. Then, "Mr. Ashford doesn't discuss business matters at home. Please call his office during—" "Tell him it's about Blackrock Mine and Millerville Mine. Tell him David Colehart needs to speak with him tonight. Tell him it's about the 105 men his family killed." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "Please hold." 5 minutes later, James Ashford III came on the line. His voice was smooth, educated, the kind of voice that was used to getting its way. "Mr. Colehart, I don't appreciate threats or accusations." "I'm not making accusations," I interrupted. "I'm stating facts. Your great-grandfather knew about the gas buildup in 1902. Your family chose profit over safety, and 105 men died for it." Silence. Then, "Those mines closed before I was born. I have no responsibility for the families of those men. Want justice. They want compensation for what your family took from them. The statute of limitations on any claims—" This isn't about legal claims, Mr. Ashford. This is about doing what's right, about acknowledging what your family's fortune was built on. He laughed, but it sounded nervous. Are you trying to blackmail me, Mr. Colehart? Because if you are, I'm trying to save your life. That shut him up. Meet me at Black Rock Mine tomorrow night at midnight, I continued. Come alone. Bring a check for $1 million made out to the Jefferson County Historical Preservation Fund. Use that money to build a memorial for the men who died in those mines. This is ridiculous. I'm not meeting some crazy forest ranger in an abandoned mine. Then you'll die within the week. I hung up and sat back in my chair. Either he'd show up or he wouldn't. Either way, I'd kept my part of the bargain with the miners. I'd given them a chance for justice. But I had a terrible feeling that justice wouldn't be enough for them anymore. Friday night came cold and clear. I drove to Black Rock Mine with a pistol on my hip and a prayer on my lips. I'd never killed a man before, but I might have to kill a dead one before this was over. The mine entrance was open again. The steel plates cut through like butter. Blue-green light pulsed from within, and I could hear singing echoing up from the depths. At 11:45, headlights appeared on the access road. A black Mercedes sedan picked its way carefully down the icy track and parked next to my truck. James Ashford III got out, looked around nervously, then walked over to me. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, well-dressed, soft-looking, the kind of man who'd never worked a day with his hands. He carried a briefcase and kept glancing at the mine entrance. "This is insane," he said. "What exactly do you think you're going to accomplish?" "Justice," I said. "Your family owes a debt to the men who died in these mines." "My family doesn't owe anyone anything. Those men knew mining was dangerous when they took the jobs." "Did they know your great-grandfather removed safety equipment to save money? Did they know he ignored gas warnings to keep production up?" Ashford's face went pale. "How do you know about—" He stopped, realizing he'd just confirmed everything. "The dead remember, Mr. Ashford. They remember everything." That's when the singing started getting louder. It wasn't coming from inside the mine anymore. It was coming from all around us, from the woods, from the hills, from the ground itself. The blue-green glow began seeping out of the mine entrance, spreading across the snow like phosphorus. "What the hell is that?" Ashford whispered. "Your creditors," I said. "Come to collect." The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 10 seconds. Our breath came out in thick white clouds. Ice began forming on the trees, on our clothes, on the windows of Ashford's Mercedes. Then they appeared. Not just from the mine this time. They rose out of the ground, stepped out of the trees, materialized from the darkness. Hundreds of glowing miners, all the men who'd died in Ashford family mines over the decades. Their blue-green light turned the mountainside into something from another world. The tall man with the beard stood directly in front of Ashford, who was frozen with terror. "James Ashford III," the dead miner said, "son of James Ashford Jr., grandson of James Ashford Sr., great-grandson of the man who murdered us." This isn't real," Ashford stammered. "This is some kind of trick, special effects." "Does this feel like a trick?" asked Sarah Millerville, appearing beside him. When she touched his shoulder, frost spread across his expensive coat. The army of dead miners began to close it. Shan, their singing getting louder and more angry. But they weren't looking at me anymore. All their attention was focused on Ashford. "The debt is due," the tall man said. 105 lives stolen for profit. 105 families destroyed by greed. "I didn't kill anyone," Ashford shouted. "That was my great-grandfather. I wasn't even born." "But you inherited the money," Sarah said. "You enjoyed the wealth built on our bones. You never tried to make amends, never acknowledged what your family did." "You want money? Fine. I'll write a check, donate to charity, build a memorial." "Too late for charity," the tall man said. "Time for justice." The miners began to glow brighter, their anger feeding the light. The methane detector on my belt was screaming. They were building gas pressure again, turning the whole mountainside into a bomb. "Wait," I shouted. "He brought the check. He's willing to make amends." The tall man looked at me with eyes like blue fire. You think money can bring back the dead? You think a memorial can undo 75 years of injustice? I think it's a start, I said. I think it's what those families would have wanted: recognition, remembrance, respect for their sacrifice. What they wanted was their husbands and fathers and sons to come home alive, Sarah said. What they got was poverty and pain and being forgotten. The singing grew louder, more voices joining in. I could see miners from other disasters now, other families destroyed by industrial greed. This wasn't just about the Ashfords anymore. This was about every worker who'd been killed for profit, every family sacrificed for stock prices. If you kill him, I said, you become murderers too. You become the same as the men who killed you. We're already dead, the tall man replied. We have nothing left to lose. The gas levels were approaching explosive now. In another minute, the whole mountainside would go up in flames, taking me and Ashford with it. The miners didn't care. They were beyond death, beyond fear, beyond everything but rage. That is when I understood what I had to do. I pulled out my gun and pointed it at James Ashford. Run, I told him. What? Run, get in your car and drive away. Don't stop until you're out of the county. You're not going to shoot me, Ashford said, but his voice was shaking. Maybe not, I said, but they will. The only reason you're still alive is because I asked them to wait. That offer expires in about 30 seconds. Ashford looked at the army of glowing miners closing in around us. His courage, what little he'd had, finally broke. He ran. He dropped his briefcase, abandoned his Mercedes, and ran into the woods on foot, crashing through ice and snow like the devil himself was chasing him. Which I suppose he was. The miners started to follow him, but I stepped into their path. Let him go, I said. Why? The tall man demanded. He's guilty. His family is guilty. Because killing him won't bring you peace, I said. It'll just add to the anger, the hatred, the cycle of violence that started all this. Then what do you suggest? Sarah asked. I picked up Ashford's briefcase, opened it, found the check inside. $1 million, just like I'd demanded. This, I said, holding up the check. Use this to tell your story. Build memorials, fund research, make sure people remember what happened here. Make sure it never happens again. The tall man laughed bitterly. You think anyone will remember? You think anyone will care about dead miners when there's money to be made? Some will, I said, and they'll teach others. Stories like yours don't die if someone keeps telling them. Pretty words, Sarah said, but the guilty should pay for their crimes. James Ashford will pay, I said. He'll spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, jumping at shadows, wondering when you'll come for him. Fear is a kind of justice, too. The miners stood there glowing in the darkness, considering my words. The methane levels were still dangerous, but they'd stopped climbing. The explosion was held back by their will alone. You'll tell our story? The tall man asked finally. I'll try. You'll make sure we're remembered? I promise. The blue-green glow began to fade, just a little. The temperature started to rise. The singing softened from anger to mourning. 105 souls, Sarah said. 105 families destroyed. 105 stories that need to be told, I replied. They looked at each other, these glowing spirits of men and women killed by greed. Then, one by one, they began to fade. Not disappearing. I could still see them, still feel their presence, but becoming less solid, less angry, more at peace. The tall man was the last to go. Remember us, he said. I will. Then he was gone, and I was alone on the mountainside with $1 million check and a story no one would believe. That was 47 years ago, and I've kept my promise. I used Ashford's money to build memorials at all the old mine sites. Simple stone markers with the names of every man who died, the dates of the disasters, and the real reasons they happened. I funded research into mining safety, scholarships for the descendants of mining families, and a museum that tells the true story of what happened in these mountains. James Ashford III never came back to West Virginia. He sold all his family's holdings in the state and moved to California. Word is he became a recluse, afraid to go out after dark, jumping at every shadow and sound. His family's fortune dwindled over the years. Bad investments, failed businesses, almost like something was working against him. Maybe it was just guilt eating him alive. Or maybe the miners found other ways to collect their debt. I kept working as a forest ranger for another 15 years until my arthritis got too bad to handle the mountain trails. But I never stopped visiting the mine sites. Every month I'd drive out to Black Rock and Millerville and the dozen other sealed shafts scattered through the forest. I'd leave flowers at the memorials, check that the warning signs were still in place, and sometimes, just sometimes, I'd hear faint singing carried on the wind. The blue-green glow never came back, but I could feel them there, watching, waiting. Not angry anymore, but not fully at rest either, like they were making sure I kept my promise. Other people started noticing things too. Hikers would report strange lights in the old mining areas. Hunters would talk about voices singing hymns in the deep woods. Local kids dared each other to spend the night near the sealed mines, but most ran home before midnight, claiming they felt watched. The state tried to dismiss these reports as folklore, but I knew better. The miners were still there, still guarding their mountains, making sure their story didn't get forgotten again. Sarah and I moved to town after I retired, but I couldn't stay away from the forest completely. Every few months, some new mining company would show up with plans to reopen one of the old sites or start strip mining on forest land. They'd file permits, hire lawyers, promise jobs and prosperity. They never lasted long. Equipment would break down for no reason. Survey crews would report compass malfunctions and GPS failures. Workers would quit after hearing voices in the tunnels or seeing figures in their headlamps. The companies would blame it on local superstition and worker hysteria. But the pattern was always the same. Within 6 months, they'd pack up and leave, usually after some kind of accident that destroyed expensive machinery but somehow never hurt anyone. The miners were still protecting their mountains, still fighting the same fight they'd started in 1902. I'm 85 now, writing this story in my kitchen, while Sarah sleeps upstairs. My hands shake when I hold a pen, and sometimes I forget words in the middle of sentences. But I remember those glowing faces as clearly as if I'd seen them yesterday. I remember every word they spoke, every promise they made me make. Next week, my grandson Tommy starts his new job with the Forest Service. He'll be working the same territory I covered for 27 years, checking the same mines, walking the same trails. I've told him the stories, taught him what to watch for, explained why certain areas should be left alone. He thinks I'm getting senile, believes the tales about glowing miners are just local folklore mixed with an old man's imagination. But he'll learn. When he's alone in those mountains, when he hears the singing echoing from sealed mine shafts, when he sees blue-green light pulsing in the darkness, then he'll understand. The miners are patient. They've been waiting in those tunnels for over a century. They can wait a little longer for the next person willing to tell their story, to remember their sacrifice, to make sure they're never forgotten again. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind is blowing through the mountains, I can still hear them singing. Not angry anymore, but not entirely peaceful either. They're still there, still watching, still making sure that justice, real justice, not the kind money can buy, gets served eventually. I've kept my promise to them for 47 years. I've told their story to anyone who would listen. I've made sure their names are carved in stone and their sacrifice is remembered. But stories have a way of fading. Memorials get weathered and forgotten, and new generations grow up thinking the past doesn't matter. That's why I'm writing this down. So when I'm gone and Tommy is the one walking those mountain trails, he'll have something to remind him. Something to show the next person who needs to understand that some debts can never be fully paid, some injustices echo through generations, and some promises must be kept no matter how much time passes. The dead remember everything, and they're still waiting in the darkness, singing their angry hymns, protecting their mountains from anyone who would repeat the sins of the past. If you ever find yourself in the Jefferson National Forest, if you see warning signs around old mine shafts, if you hear voices singing in the wind, remember the men who died for other people's greed. Remember the families destroyed by corporate profits. Remember that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's just justice waiting for the right moment to collect what it's owed. And if you see a blue-green glow pulsing from the depths of a sealed mine shaft, if you hear 73 voices singing Amazing Grace with words of warning instead of worship, listen to them. They have important things to say about the price of greed and the cost of forgetting the past. My name is David Colehart, and this is my testament. The miners trusted me with their story, and now I'm trusting you with it. Don't let them be forgotten again. They're still down there, still watching, still waiting, and they remember everything. My name is Rebecca Thornhill, and I've been a ranger in the Chattahoochee National Forest for 16 years. I've seen bears charge hikers, watched lightning split trees in half, and pulled more lost souls off these mountains than I care to count. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on Blood Mountain in October of 1987. I chose this work after coming back from Vietnam. The Army taught me discipline, but the war taught me I needed quiet places to heal. These Georgia mountains gave me that peace. Every morning, I'd wake up in my cabin near Neal's Gap, strap on my gear, and head out to check the trails. The Appalachian Trail runs right over Blood Mountain's summit, and keeping those paths safe was my job. At 41, I thought I'd seen everything these woods could throw at me. Bears, handle them with noise and common sense. Lost hikers, follow the basic rules and bring them home. Drunk college kids camping where they shouldn't, easy enough to deal with. I never believed the old stories about wild people living deep in the forest. Every ranger hears them. Tales of feral humans who'd gone back to living like animals, hiding in caves and stealing from campsites. Old-timers love to spook the new guys with these stories, but I figured they were just mountain legends like Bigfoot or the Beast of Bladenboro. The Cherokee called this place the mountain where blood was spilled long before white settlers showed up. They fought the Creek Nation here, and later, Revolutionary War battles left their mark too. Local folks claimed deserters from the Civil War had run off into these hills and never came back to civilization. Their children and grandchildren supposedly still lived up there, watching us from the shadows. I'd laugh and shake my head whenever someone brought up the wild men. Rebecca, I'd tell myself, you've been up and down every trail on this mountain for over a decade. If there were people living wild up here, you'd have found some trace of them by now. That October morning started like any other. The Weather Service was calling for an early storm, snow and ice, unusual for that time of year. I grabbed my radio, first aid kit, and trail maintenance tools. My plan was simple. Check the shelters between Neal's Gap and the summit, make sure everything was secure before the weather hit. The air felt different that morning, heavy and still in a way that made my skin crawl. Animals were acting strange too. I'd been walking for maybe an hour when I noticed it. No bird sounds, no squirrels chattering in the trees. Even the insects had gone quiet. In 16 years of ranging, I'd learned to trust my gut about these things. When the forest goes silent, something's wrong. I keyed my radio to check in with headquarters. Static. That wasn't unusual in the mountains, but it added to my growing unease. The trail up to Blood Mountain is steep and rocky, winding through dense stands of mountain laurel and rhododendron. In some places, the thickets grow so thick you can't see 10 feet off the path. About halfway to the summit, I found the first sign that this wouldn't be an ordinary day. Someone had been at the Flat Rock Gap shelter recently. Very recently. The fire ring still held warm ashes, but whoever had been there was long gone. What bothered me wasn't that someone had used the shelter. It was how they'd left it. The firewood was stacked in a perfect spiral, each piece exactly the same length. Small stones had been arranged around the shelter in patterns that looked almost like symbols. And the smell. There was something in the air I couldn't identify, earthy and wild, like wet animal fur mixed with wood smoke. I took notes and photos, standard procedure for anything unusual, but my hands were shaking slightly as I wrote, and I couldn't explain why. The silence in the woods felt heavier now, like something was watching me work. As I packed up to continue toward the summit, I heard it for the cahos. First time, a sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. It started as a low whistle, almost like wind through trees, but too regular, too purposeful. Then it stopped abruptly, leaving the forest even quieter than before. I stood frozen for maybe 30 seconds, listening. Nothing. Just my own heartbeat and the sound of my breathing. Getting spooked over nothing, I muttered, but I checked my knife and made sure my radio was clipped securely to my belt. The trail continued upward, winding between massive boulders and through patches of stunted oak trees. With each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I'd learned to trust these instincts during my military service. They'd kept me alive in some very bad places. When I reached the next trail junction, I stopped to check my map and radio in my position. Still nothing but static. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were in a patch of soft earth beside the trail. Human prints, but wrong somehow. The feet were wider than normal, with longer toes that looked almost like they had claws. And they were barefoot, despite the cold October weather that had me wearing boots and thermal layers. The prints led off the main trail into the thick laurel bushes, disappearing where the ground turned rocky. I followed them for maybe 20 yards before common sense kicked in. Whatever made those tracks was either gone or hiding nearby. Either way, wandering off trail alone wasn't smart. I headed back to the main path, but the damage was done. Those prints had shattered my comfortable certainty that I knew everything about these mountains. Someone, or something, was up here with me, and they clearly weren't following normal human patterns. The wind picked up as I climbed higher, bringing the smell of snow and ice. The storm was coming in faster than predicted, and I needed to reach the summit shelter before it hit. But every shadow in the forest now seemed to hide movement, and every sound made me reach for my knife. The Blood Mountain shelter sits just below the summit, a three-sided stone building that saved countless hikers from bad weather over the years. As I approached it that morning, I could see someone had been there recently. Smoke drifted from the fire ring, and gear was scattered around the shelter's interior. "Hello?" I called out, following standard protocol. "Forest Service." No response. I approached carefully, my hand resting on my radio even though I knew it wasn't working. Inside the shelter, I found a scene that made my blood run cold. A hiker's backpack lay torn open, contents scattered everywhere. Canned food had been opened with what looked like sharp stones rather than a can opener, leaving jagged metal edges. Clothing was shredded as if by claws or very sharp knives. But there was no blood, no sign of struggle. Just destruction and that same wild smell I'd noticed at the previous shelter, now much stronger. I started gathering the scattered items, looking for identification. The pack belonged to Marcus Webb, a college student from Atlanta, according to his trail register entry. He'd signed in at Neal's Gap 2 days ago, planning a solo hike to the summit. That's when I heard the whistling again, closer this time. It came from somewhere up near the actual summit, a series of notes that sounded almost like a signal. Before I could react, it was answered by another whistle from the opposite direction, then another from somewhere behind me. I grabbed my radio and tried again. "Base, this is Ranger Thornhill. I'm at Blood Mountain Shelter with a possible missing hiker situation." "Over." Static and interference, but underneath it, I could swear I heard that same whistling sound coming through the radio speaker. The smart thing would have been to head back K down immediately, get to a point where my radio worked and call for backup. But Marcus Webb was somewhere on this mountain, and if he was injured or in trouble, he needed help now. The approaching storm would make any rescue attempt impossible once it hit. I secured the torn gear and started up the final stretch to the summit. The trail here is steep and rocky, winding between massive boulders that create natural hiding spots. Every step took me further from safety and deeper into whatever was happening on Blood Mountain. The summit of Blood Mountain offers a panoramic view of North Georgia's mountains, stretching to the horizon in every direction. On a clear day, you can see for miles. But as I reached the top, fog was already rolling in from the approaching storm, limiting visibility to maybe 50 yards. The summit area was wrong. I'd been up there hundreds of times, but now it looked different. Stones had been moved, arranged in circles and lines that definitely weren't natural. Small animal skulls hung from tree branches, and I could see paths leading off into the boulders that I'd never noticed before. I was photographing these strange arrangements when I saw him. Marcus Webb was sitting on a rock outcropping about 30 yards away, facing away from me toward the western view. He was completely still, unnaturally still, like a statue. My relief at finding him alive quickly turned to concern. "Marcus," I called out. "Marcus Webb, Forest Service." He didn't respond, didn't even move. I approached carefully, my training telling me something was very wrong with this situation. When I got close enough to see him clearly, I had to fight down the urge to run. Marcus was alive, but barely recognizable as the college student whose photo I'd seen on his driver's license. His clothes were mostly gone, replaced by what looked like animal skins crudely sewn together. His hair was matted with mud and leaves. His fingernails had grown long and were caked with dirt. But it was his eyes that really scared me. When he finally turned to look at me, there was no recognition, no human intelligence. He looked at me the way a wild animal looks at potential prey, calculating, predatory, completely without fear. "Marcus," I said softly, keeping my voice calm. "I'm Rebecca, a forest ranger. I'm here to help you get home." He tilted his head at the sound of my voice, and that's when I saw the scars. His neck and arms were covered with what looked like bite marks, some old and healed, others recent. Someone or something had been feeding on him. Marcus made a sound that was barely human, a low growling that raised every hair on my body. Then he smiled, and I saw that his teeth had been filed to sharp points. I was reaching for my radio when the whistling started again, all around us now. Marcus's head snapped toward the sounds, and he let out an answering call that sounded like a bird cry mixed with a human scream. That's when they showed themselves. They came out of the rocks and fog like ghosts, moving with a fluid grace that was definitely not human. 5 of them, maybe 6. It was hard to count because they moved so quickly and the visibility was getting worse. They looked human at first glance, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, moving on all fours as easily as upright. Their skin was pale and mottled, like it had never seen sunlight. Their hair was long and tangled, and they wore scraps of clothing mixed with animal pelts. But it was the way they moved that really got to me. Completely silent, coordinated like a pack of wolves. They circled us without making a sound, and I knew I was looking at the source of all those wild man stories. The largest one, the pack leader, I guess, stood upright and looked directly at me. His eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost white. When he opened his mouth, I saw the same filed teeth that Marcus had. He whistled once, sharp and commanding. Marcus immediately got up and moved to join the group. Just like that, the college student from Atlanta became part of whatever these things were. I tried to back away slowly, but they moved to cut off my retreat. The leader whistled again, a different pattern this time, and I realized they were communicating in some kind of language. "I don't want any trouble," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm just doing my job. I'll leave right now and not come back." The leader tilted his head, studying me. For a moment, I thought he might actually understand. Then he smiled that terrible sharp-toothed smile and took a step forward. That's when the storm hit in earnest. Sleet and snow came down in sheets, reducing visibility to almost nothing. In the chaos of the sudden weather, I heard them moving around me, but I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. I ran. I made it maybe 100 yards down the trail before I realized running was exactly what they wanted me to do. The whistling sounds were coming from all around me now, following my movement, coordinating their hunt. These things had been living in these mountains for generations. They knew every rock, every tree, every hiding spot. I was on their territory, playing by their rules. I stopped running and tried to think like a soldier instead of prey. Find defensible position, assess threats, make a plan. The problem was, I was dealing with something completely outside my training manual. The storm was getting worse by the minute. Ice was forming on the trees, making the rocks slippery and treacherous. Normal protocol would be to find shelter and wait it out, but the shelter was back up there with them. I needed to get down the mountain, get to my truck, get help. But they weren't going to let me leave. I could hear them moving through the forest around me, keeping pace as I tried to descend the trail. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, a pale shape flitting between the trunks. They were herding me, driving me towards something. About halfway down to Flat Rock Gap, the trail makes a sharp switchback around a massive boulder. As I came around the turn, I found another hiker. She was hanging from a tree branch about 8 feet off the ground, suspended by what looked like twisted vines and strips of bark. Still alive, barely conscious, making small, whimpering sounds. Her name tag said, Jennifer, University of Georgia. She'd been stripped and covered with the same bite marks I'd seen on Marcus. I grabbed my knife and started cutting her down, but I knew it was a trap. They'd put her there for me to find, to slow me down, to make me predictable. But I couldn't leave her. As I worked to free Jennifer, I heard them getting closer. The whistling was coming from maybe 3 different directions now, coordinated signals that were clearly some kind of hunting communication. I got Jennifer down and tried to wake her up, but she was in shock, barely responsive. Jennifer, listen to me, I whispered urgently. We have to move. Can you walk? She opened her eyes and looked at me, but I'm not sure she actually saw me. Whatever they'd done to her had broken something inside. She kept mumbling about the feeders and going back to the old ways. I got her on her feet and tried to help her down the trail, but we weren't moving fast enough. The sounds in the forest were getting closer, and through the sleet and snow I could see shapes moving between the trees. That's when I made my first real mistake. Instead of staying on the main trail, I tried to take a shortcut through the woods, thinking I could lose them in the thick laurel bushes. All I did was get us lost and trapped. The laurel thickets on Blood Mountain are legendary for swallowing hikers. The branches grow together so thick that you can crawl through tunnels in the undergrowth, completely hidden from above, but also completely disoriented. I'd pulled people out of these tangles before, but I'd never tried to navigate them, in a storm while being hunted. Jennifer and I crawled through the laurel for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The whole time, I could hear them moving above us and around us. Sometimes, a pale hand would reach down through the branches, just inches from our heads. They knew exactly where we were, but for some reason, they weren't attacking. When we finally emerged from the laurel hell, we were completely off trail in a part of the mountain I didn't recognize. The storm had gotten worse, with ice coating everything and making movement treacherous. Jennifer was hypothermic, shaking uncontrollably and no longer able to walk without help. I found a small overhang in the rocks that offered some protection from the weather. As I was trying to get Jennifer warm, I discovered something that made my blood freeze. Carved into the rock wall were symbols and pictures, obviously very old, but still clear. They showed human figures hunting other humans, feeding rituals, and what looked like some kind of worship or ceremony. Below the carvings was a pile of bones. Human bones, some of them recent enough to still have bits of flesh attached. I counted at least 6 skulls, maybe more. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a feeding site. Jennifer saw the bones and started laughing, a horrible sound that echoed off the rocks. "You found it," she whispered. "You found where they bring the chosen ones. They're going to be so pleased." That's when I realized the truth. Jennifer wasn't a victim they'd captured. She was bait they'd positioned to lead me here. Whatever these things were, they were a lot smarter than I'd given them credit for. The whistling started again, much closer now. I could see movement at the entrance to our little cave. They'd driven me exactly where they wanted me, trapped with nowhere to run, in their sacred feeding place, but I wasn't going to make it easy for them. I pulled out my knife and my emergency flare gun. 2 shots. That's all I had. If I was going down, I was taking some of them with me. The first one appeared a cave entrance, moving in that fluid, inhuman way. Up close, I could see details that made my skin crawl. Its skin was covered with scars and bite marks, but also paint or tattoos made from what looked like mud and blood. Bones and pieces of metal were woven into its matted hair. Around its neck hung a necklace of human teeth. It looked at Jennifer and made a soft, chittering sound. She immediately started crawling toward it, like a dog responding to its master's call. "No!" I grabbed her arm, but she pulled away with strength that shouldn't have been possible in her condition. The creature looked at me and smiled, showing those filed teeth. Then it spoke, in a voice like gravel and broken glass. New one comes to the old place. Good. Been too long since feeding time. It could talk. These weren't just feral humans. They were something else. Something that had evolved or changed into apex predators that saw other humans as prey. And they'd been doing it for a very long time. I raised my flare gun and fired. The flare hit the creature's center mass and exploded in red fire. It screamed and stumbled backward, clawing at the burning phosphorus. But instead of running or dying, it just looked angry. The scream brought the others. I could see them moving outside the cave, pale shapes in the storm. Too many to fight, too many to escape. I fired my second flare at the cave entrance, hoping to create enough light and fire to keep them back. For a moment, it worked. They retreated into the storm, hissing and chittering in their language, but I knew it was only temporary. They were patient hunters, and I was trapped with limited weapons and a collaborator who'd been turned against me. That's when I heard the helicopter. The sound of rotors cutting through the storm was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. Someone had missed me on my scheduled radio check-in, search and rom. Rescue was coming. But the Ridge Runners heard it too. Their reaction was immediate and violent. The chittering sounds turned to angry shrieks, and I could see them moving frantically outside the cave. The helicopter represented everything they feared. The outside world finding them, their hunting ground being discovered, their ancient way of life being exposed. Jennifer started screaming, a sound that barely seemed human. "They're coming! The sky hunters are coming! We have to hide deeper!" I grabbed my radio and tried again. Through the static and interference, I heard a voice. "Rebecca, this is Search Team Alpha. If you can hear this, we're tracking your GPS beacon. Hold tight." GPS beacon. I'd forgotten about the emergency transponder clipped to my belt. Thank God for standard safety equipment. But the Ridge Runners weren't going to let me reach that helicopter. They came at us in a coordinated rush, flowing into the cave like water. Up close, fighting for my life, I got my best look at what they really were. They'd been human once, maybe generations ago. But living wild in the mountains, inbreeding, adapting to a predatory lifestyle, they'd become something else. Their bones were wrong, elongated and twisted. Their joints bent in directions that shouldn't have been possible. Their skin was thick and scarred like leather, and they moved with a fluid coordination that spoke of decades of hunting together as a pack. I used my knife on the first one that reached me, opening a long gash across its chest. Black blood flowed out, but it didn't seem to notice the wound. It just kept coming, those pale eyes fixed on my throat. I fell backward, hitting the cave wall hard. Carved bones and skulls rained down on me as the creature lunged. Its teeth were inches from my neck when Jennifer attacked it from behind. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Jennifer, who'd been their bait, their converted collaborator, suddenly turned on them with a fury that was purely human. She grabbed a sharp piece of bone from the cave floor and drove it into the creature's back, again and again screaming curse words that would have made a sailor blush. "Nobody feeds on me," she yelled. "Nobody makes me their pet." The Ridge Runner spun around and backhanded her across the cave. She hit the wall and didn't get up. But her attack had given me the seconds I needed. I rolled to my feet and grabbed the emergency flare that was still burning at the cave entrance. The remaining Ridge Runners, there were 4 of them now, had backed away from the light and heat. Fire was their weakness. It represented human technology, human control over the natural world they'd rejected. Outside, the helicopter sound was getting closer. I could see searchlight beams cutting through the storm. The pack leader, the one I'd first seen at the summit, stepped forward. In the flare light, I could see him clearly for the first time. He was tall, maybe 7 feet, but hunched and twisted. His skin was painted with symbols that matched the cave carvings. Around his waist hung a belt made of human scalps. "You bring the sky hunters to our mountain," he said in that broken glass voice. "This is not allowed. Mountain is ours, always has been ours." "Not anymore," I told him. "This ends now." He laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Ends. Little ranger woman thinks she can end the old ways. We've been here since before your great-great-grandparents. We fed on Cherokee, on settlers, on soldiers. We fed on everyone who comes to our mountain. Through the cave entrance, I could see the helicopter searchlights sweeping back and forth. They were close, but not close enough, and I was running out of flare. Your stories, the pack leader continued. Your legends about wild men in the mountains, all true, but you got it backwards. We not the ones who went wild. We the ones who stayed true, stayed strong. Humans supposed to hunt, supposed to feed, supposed to take what they need. It understood then. These weren't people who'd gone feral and lost their humanity. They were people who'd rejected everything about modern civilization and chosen to become pure predators. They saw themselves as superior to regular humans, evolved beyond the need for society or morality. Civilization makes humans weak, he said. Soft, easy prey. We keep the old strength, the old hunger. The flare was dimming. In maybe 30 more seconds, I'd be fighting in the dark against creatures who could see perfectly in caves. That's when I remembered something from my military training. When you're outnumbered and outgunned, you don't fight the enemy. You fight the ground. The cave was full of old bones and debris, dry as kindling. I touched the dying flare to a pile of ancient human remains, and they caught fire immediately. The flames spread quickly in the dry air, turning the cave into a furnace. The ridge runners screamed and fled toward the back of the cave, but there was nowhere to go. This was their sacred place, their feeding ground, and now it was burning around them. I grabbed Jennifer, still unconscious but breathing, and dragged her toward the cave entrance. Behind us, I could hear the pack leader screaming orders in their chittering language, but his followers were more interested in escaping the fire than obeying. Outside the cave, the storm was still raging, but the helicopter searchlights swept across us like a blessing. I waved my arms and shouted, though I doubt they could hear me over the rotors and wind. The pack leader appeared at the cave entrance, his skin blackened by smoke, his pale eyes filled with a rage that was absolutely inhuman. "You burn the old place," he snarled. "You burn the sacred feeding ground. For this, we hunt you forever, you and your bloodline. We never forget. We never forgive." The helicopter was landing in a small clearing about 50 yards away. I could see figures in rescue gear jumping out, fighting their way through the storm toward us. The pack leader looked at the approaching rescuers, then back at me. "This not over, Ranger woman. Mountains still ours. We still hungry, and humans still good eating." He melted back into the storm, disappearing into the forest like smoke. But his words followed me. We never forget. The rescue team reached us just as I collapsed from exhaustion and shock. The last thing I remember clearly was being loaded into the helicopter, watching the burning cave fade into the darkness below. I spent 3 days in the hospital in Gainesville being treated for hypothermia and exhaustion. Jennifer was there too, in the psychiatric wing. The official report said she'd suffered severe trauma and exposure, leading to temporary psychological breakdown. Nobody mentioned the bite marks or the fact that she kept asking the nurses when feeding time was. Marcus Webb's body was found 2 weeks later, after the storm passed and full search teams could get up the mountain. The official cause of death was exposure and animal predation. Black bears, they said. Very aggressive black bears. They never found the cave. When I led a team back to the location where I remembered it being, there was nothing but solid rock face. Either I'd been more disoriented than I thought, or the ridge runners had sealed it somehow. The Forest Service decided I'd been hallucinating from hypothermia and stress. I tried to tell my supervisors the truth. I showed them my photos of the strange arrangements on the summit, the symbols carved in trees, the evidence that something was living up there. They listened politely and recommended I take extended leave for psychological counseling. The thing is, they weren't entirely wrong. What I'd seen up there had changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I'd looked into the face of something that rejected everything I believed about human nature, and it had marked me. I returned to work after 6 months of mandatory therapy, but Blood Mountain Inn was off limits to me. For your own mental health, they said. They assigned me to the lower elevation trails, the family camping areas, the safe places where the worst thing you might encounter is a raccoon in your cooler. But I knew they were still up there. The reports kept coming in. Hikers who swore they'd seen pale figures moving through the trees. Campers who found their food stolen and replaced with arrangements of animal bones. Trail runners who heard whistling in the forest that sounded almost like language. Most people dismissed these stories just like I had before my encounter. Park Service policy was to blame everything on bears or imagination. But I knew better. 3 years after my experience, I got a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a piece of bark with symbols carved into it. The same symbols I'd seen in the cave. Below them, carved in rough letters, were the words, "We remember." I moved to Florida after that. Took a job with the state park system managing beaches and wetlands. Miles from any mountains, surrounded by tourists and development. Safe. But every time I hear about missing hikers in Appalachia, every time someone reports seeing wild men in the mountains, I know the truth. The ridge runners are still up there, still hunting, still feeding. They're patient, and they're smart, and they see us as nothing more than prey that's forgotten how to run. The Cherokee were right to call it Blood Mountain. They just didn't understand whose blood it was meant to spill. I'm retired now, living in a small town on the Gulf Coast. My neighbors think I'm just another old ranger with too many stories and not enough sense to keep quiet about them. But sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear whistling in the distance. Coordinated signals in an ancient language. And I know they're coming south, following the mountain chains, expanding their hunting grounds, looking for new feeding places, new prey. If you ever find yourself hiking alone in the southern Appalachians and you hear whistling in the forest, that sounds too purposeful to be wind. Don't investigate. Don't try to help if you find evidence of other hikers. Just leave. Get off the mountain as fast as you can, because the ridge runners of Blood Mountain are still out there, and they remember every face they've seen, every scent they've smelled, every person who's glimpsed their secret world. They're still hungry, and we still look like dinner. My name is Jacob Stillwater, and I've been a forest ranger for 14 years. Before that, I spent 8 years as a federal revenue agent, chasing down illegal stills and bootleggers across Kentucky's backwoods. Most folks think I switched jobs because I got tired of the danger. Truth is, I just found a better way to protect these mountains I love. It was June 1973, and the heat was killing everything. We hadn't seen rain in 3 weeks, and the forest was dry as old newspaper. Fire danger was at the highest level, which meant I was pulling double shifts, checking for smoke and making sure nobody was doing anything stupid with flames. That morning, I got a radio call from my supervisor, Bill Henderson. "Jake, we got reports of smoke coming from Devil's Hollow again. Might be another still operation." I knew Devil's Hollow well. It was a hidden valley about 4 hours' hike from the nearest road, tucked away where most tourists would never find it. The locals had been running moonshine out of there since before Kentucky was even a state. During my revenue agent days, I'd raided 3 different operations in that hollow. Each time we'd destroy the equipment, arrest whoever we could catch, and within 6 months, they'd be back at it. "I'll check it out," I told Bill. "Probably just morning mist off the spring." But I knew it wasn't mist. There had been stories about that hollow for as long as anyone could remember. Old-timers said the place was protected, that anyone who tried to shut down the stills would meet with bad luck. As a revenue agent, I'd laughed at such talk. Superstition was just another tool the bootleggers used to keep people away. I loaded my pack with enough supplies for 2 days, just in case. Water, first aid kit, my service radio, and my .38 revolver. The gun wasn't for the bootleggers. Mountain folks weren't usually violent unless you backed them into a corner. It was for the bears and wild dogs that sometimes roamed these hills. The trail to Devil's Hollow wasn't marked on any map. You had to know the old logging roads, then follow a creek bed that wound through limestone cliffs. The bootleggers had done everything they could over the years to hide the path. They'd move fallen trees across the route, fill in obvious tracks, and even plant thorny bushes to discourage casual hikers. As I walked, the heat pressed down like a heavy blanket. My uniform shirt stuck to my back and sweat ran into my eyes. The forest around me was too quiet. Usually, you'd hear birds singing, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing. Today, there was just the sound of my boots on dry leaves and my own breathing. About 2 hours in, I started noticing things that didn't feel right. There were patches of ground where nothing grew, as if the soil itself was poisoned. I found animal bones scattered around these dead spots. Not the clean bones you'd see after a natural death, but blackened and twisted like they'd been burned from the inside. The creek that led to the hollow was running lower than I'd ever seen it. The water looked clear enough, but it had a strange smell, not rotten, but sharp and chemical, like the cleaning fluid we used on gun barrels. I knelt down to examine it more closely and noticed an oily film on the surface. That's when I heard the first sound that made my skin crawl. It was like glass breaking, but far away and musical, almost like wind chimes. I looked around, but there was no wind to speak of. The air hung still and heavy around me. I checked my watch. It was past noon, and I still had 2 hours of hiking ahead. The smart thing would be to turn back, come again tomorrow with backup. But something about that hollow was calling to me. In my revenue agent days, I'd developed good instincts about when bootleggers woo. You're up to something big. This felt like one of those times. As I got closer to the hollow, I started finding more evidence of human activity. There were footprints in the mud by the creek, fresh ones, made within the last day or two. Someone had been hauling heavy loads along this path recently. I could see where they'd dragged something, probably barrels or equipment. But there were other prints too, ones that didn't make sense. They looked almost human, but wrong somehow. Too long, with what appeared to be claw marks at the tips. I knelt down for a closer look and felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. These prints were burned into the mud, as if whatever made them had been hot enough to cook the ground. The smell in the air was getting stronger too. It wasn't just the chemical odor from the creek anymore. There was something else mixed in. A sweet, cloying scent like overripe fruit, but with an undertone that reminded me of burning copper. I was starting to understand why the old-timers told stories about this place. The entrance to Devil's Hollow was hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines and wild grape clusters. You had to know exactly where to push through, or you'd walk right past it. I'd been here enough times that my feet found the path automatically. As soon as I stepped through that natural doorway, the temperature dropped at least 10 degrees. The hollow was like a natural amphitheater, with steep walls on 3 sides and a crystal-clear spring bubbling up from the center. Under normal circumstances, it was one of the most beautiful spots in the entire forest. But today, something was very wrong. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Even the spring, which usually gurgled and splashed cheerfully, seemed muffled. The water still flowed, but it made almost no sound as it ran over the rocks. Then I saw the still. It was the biggest operation I'd ever encountered. 3 large copper kettles, each one easily holding 50 gallons, connected by a maze of copper pipes and cooling coils. The whole setup was more sophisticated than a thing I'd seen during my revenue agent days. This wasn't some backwoods farmer making drinking money. This was professional-level production. But the equipment looked old, not just used, but ancient. The copper had a green patina that spoke of decades of use, and the wooden platforms were gray with age. Some of the metal pieces had markings I didn't recognize, symbols that looked almost like letters, but in no alphabet I'd ever seen. I pulled out my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static. That wasn't unusual in the hollow. The limestone cliffs interfered with radio signals. I'd have to hike back to higher ground to make contact. As I moved closer to examine the still, I caught sight of movement from the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, hand moving instinctively toward my weapon, but saw nothing, just shadows shifting between the trees. "Hello?" I called out. "Forest Service, I need to talk to whoever's running this operation." My voice echoed strangely in the hollow, seeming to bounce back with extra words I hadn't spoken. For just a moment, I could have sworn I heard my own voice saying, "You don't belong here." I shook my head. The heat was getting to me. I started documenting the still with my camera, taking pictures from different angles. This would be evidence when we came back with a full raiding party. Through the viewfinder, everything looked normal. But when I lowered the camera, I kept catching glimpses of things that shouldn't be there. A man in old-fashioned clothes standing by the largest kettle. A woman in a long dress bending over the spring. Children playing at the edge of the clearing. Every time I looked directly at these figures, they vanished. But they were there in my peripheral vision, going about their business as if I was the one who didn't belong. The smell was stronger here too. That sweet copper scent was almost overwhelming, and underneath it was something else. Something that reminded me of my grandfather's funeral home. The smell of preservation, of things that should decay, but don't. I was examining the largest kettle when I heard footsteps behind me. Real footsteps this time, crunching on dry leaves. I spun around, relief flooding through me. Finally, someone I could talk to, but there was nobody there. The footsteps continued, though. Slow, deliberate steps that circled around me, always staying just out of sight. I drew my service revolver and called out again. "I'm armed! Show yourself!" The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was deeper than before, as if even the insects had stopped breathing. I stood perfectly still, listening so hard that my ears hurt. That's when I noticed the barrels. There were 6 of them, arranged in a neat line at the back of the clearing. They looked new. The wood was still pale yellow, and the metal bands shined like they'd been polished yesterday. But that was impossible. I'd been in this hollow just 3 months ago, and there had been no barrels then. I approached them carefully, keeping my gun drawn. The first barrel had a symbol burned into its side, the same strange markings I'd seen on the still equipment. When I got close enough, I could smell what was inside. Pure grain alcohol, probably 180 proof or higher. Strong enough to strip paint or use as fuel. But there was something else in that smell. Something organic and wrong, like meat that had been left too long in the sun. I was trying to decide whether to open one of the barrels when I heard the voice. "You shouldn't have come back, revenue man." It was a man's voice, deep and gravelly, with the thick mountain accent I knew well. But there was something else in it, a quality that made my teeth ache, like the sound was coming from somewhere deeper than a human throat. I spun toward the voice, gun raised. "Show yourself! I'm a forest ranger, not a revenue agent." Laughter echoed through the hollow. Not friendly laughter, but the kind you hear from someone, and who's caught you in a lie you didn't know you were telling. Once a revenue man, always a revenue man. You can put on that green uniform, but you still got the stink of federal law on you. I was turning in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. The trees, the ground, even the still equipment itself. "Who are you?" I called out. "This is illegal activity on federal land. You need to shut down this operation." The laughter came again, and this time it was joined by other voices. Women's voices, children's voices, all laughing at some joke I wasn't part of. "Federal land," the main voice repeated, mocking. "Boy, my family's been making shine in this hollow since before there was a federal anything. This ain't your land. This is our land. And we don't take kindly to interference." That's when I saw him. He stepped out from behind the largest kettle like he'd been there all along. He was tall and thin, wearing clothes that looked like they were from the 1920s or earlier. Suspenders, white shirt, dark pants, all of it somehow pristine despite being decades old. His face was sharp and angular, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with their own light. But it was his hands that made me take a step backward. They looked burned, like he'd thrust them into fire and never pulled them out. The skin was black and cracked, and when he moved his fingers, I could see red light gleaming between the cracks. "Name's Ezekiel Hollow," he said, and I realized this was where the place had gotten its name. "I've been making the finest whiskey in Kentucky for longer than you've been alive. Longer than your daddy been alive, most likely." I kept my gun pointed at him, but my hands were starting to shake. There was something about this man that violated every natural law I'd ever known. He cast no shadow despite the bright sunlight. And when he breathed, no vapor came from his mouth despite the sudden cold. And his eyes, God help me, his eyes looked like they held the fires of hell itself. "Mr. Hollow," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know how you've managed to avoid detection for so long, but this operation is over. You need to come with me." He smiled, and I saw that his teeth were the color of old copper. "Oh, I don't think so, Revenue Man. See, last time you federals came for my still, things didn't go so well for me. So I made myself a promise. Next time, things weren't going to go so well for you." That's when the first barrel exploded. The explosion knocked me flat on my back and filled the hollow with the stench of burning alcohol. When my ears stopped ringing, I could hear liquid splashing and the crackle of flames. I rolled over and saw that the barrel furthest from me had burst open like someone had lit a stick of dynamite inside it. Clear liquid was running everywhere, and where it touched the ground, small fires were starting to spring up. But Ezekiel Hollow was gone. I scrambled to my feet, still clutching my revolver. The fires were spreading fast, too fast for natural alcohol burns. These flames were moving like they were alive, reaching out with burning fingers to touch the dry grass and dead leaves scattered around the clearing. "This is bad," I muttered, looking around for an escape route. In this drought, a fire could consume the entire forest in hours. I had to get out of the hollow and radio for help. That's when I heard the laughter again, coming from the flames themselves. "Where you going, Revenue Man? We ain't finished our business yet." I spun toward the voice and saw something that made my blood turn to ice water. Ezekiel Hollow was standing in the middle of the largest fire, completely unharmed. The flames were dancing around him like they were welcoming an old friend. As I watched, he reached down and scooped up a handful of burning alcohol, letting it run between his fingers like water. "You like my little demonstration?" he asked, his voice carrying easily over the roar of the flames. "That's nothing compared to what I can really do." A second barrel exploded, then a third. Each explosion sent more burning liquid in all directions, creating a maze of fire between me and the only exit I knew. The heat was intense enough to singe my eyebrows, even from 50 feet away. But the worst part was that I could see other people in the flames now. The shadowy figures I'd glimpsed earlier were becoming solid, stepping out of the fire like it was a doorway. Men in old work clothes, women in long dresses, children with faces too old for their small bodies. All of them had the same burned, cracked hands as Ezekiel, and all of them were looking at me with expressions of cold hatred. "Meet the family," Ezekiel said, gesturing to the growing crowd of figures. Every one of them killed by federal agents over the years, shot down like dogs for the crime of making honest whiskey. I backed toward the spring, hoping the water might give me some protection from the spreading fires. But as soon as my boots touched the edge of the creek, the water began to bubble and steam. I yanked my feet back just as the surface of the spring burst into flames. "How?" I gasped. "Water doesn't burn." "This water does," Ezekiel replied. "Been soaking up our shine for 150 years. Got so much alcohol in it now, it's more whiskey than water." The burning spring cast everything in an orange glow that made the hollow look like the entrance to hell. The limestone walls trapped the heat, turning the natural amphitheater into an oven. My uniform was soaked with sweat, and I could feel my skin starting to blister from the radiant heat. I tried to push through the wall of flame that blocked the entrance, but the fire reached out for me like living things. Tendrils of burning vapor wrapped around my arms, and I felt the hair on my arms singe away. I stumbled back, beating at my sleeves. "There's no way out," one of the women called to me. Her voice sounded like wind through dry corn stalks. "Just like there was no way out for us when your kind came calling." That's when I remembered the caves. During my revenue agent days, I'd discovered that the back wall of the hollow was honeycombed with small caves where the bootleggers stored their finished product. If I could reach one of those caves, I might be able to find another way out, or at least shelter until the fires burned themselves out. I made a run for the back wall, dodging between patches of flame. The ghostly figures reached for me as I passed, and wherever their burned hands touched my clothes, the fabric began to smolder. I could hear them whispering threats and curses, their voices blending together into a chorus of hate. The largest cave entrance was about 10 feet up the limestone wall, accessible only by climbing over broken rocks and small ledges. I holstered my gun and started climbing, feeling the heat from below making the rocks almost too hot to touch. Behind me, Ezekiel's voice boomed through the hollow. "You can't hide forever, revenue man. This is our home, and we know every inch of it." I pulled myself into the cave just as another barrel exploded below. The shockwave nearly knocked me back out, but I managed to crawl deeper into the tunnel. The cave was cooler than the hollow, but not by much. I could feel hot air flowing past me, which meant there had to be another opening somewhere ahead. As I crawled forward, my hands encountered something that made me recoil in disgust. Bones, human bones, scattered across the cave floor like broken sticks. I pulled out my flashlight and saw dozens of skeletons, all wearing the rotted remains of federal uniforms. Revenue agents, just like I used to be. Some of the bones showed signs of burning, but others looked like they'd been dissolved by acid. A few of the skulls had holes that looked like they'd been drilled by something sharp and precise. These weren't quick deaths. These people had suffered. At the back of the cave, I found what I was looking for. Another tunnel that led upward toward the rim of the hollow. But blocking the entrance was the largest collection of bones I'd seen yet. These weren't revenue agents. The clothing remnants were older, civilian. Bootleggers probably killed by federal raids over the decades. But they weren't just lying there. They were arranged deliberately, stacked into a barrier that completely blocked the tunnel. And as I watched, the bones began to move, knitting themselves back together into complete skeletons that turned to face me with empty eye sockets. "Going somewhere?" one of them asked in a voice like grinding gravel. I drew my gun and fired 3 quick shots. The bullets passed right through the skeleton without effect, and I heard Ezekiel's laughter echoing from the main chamber behind me. "Bullets won't help you now, revenue man. You're in our world, and we play by our rules." The skeleton reached for me with hands that dripped some kind of corrosive liquid. Where the drops hit the cave floor, they sizzled and smoked. I scrambled backward, but more bones were rising around me, forming a circle of undead bootleggers and federal agents. That's when I noticed something important. The bones that were moving all showed signs of being burned or dissolved. But there were some scattered skeletons that remained still, ones that looked like they'd died from ordinary gunshots or injuries. The fire. Whatever force animated these dead was connected to the supernatural flames below. Ezekiel had power over anything that died by burning or by his toxic alcohol. But the ones who died naturally were beyond his reach. I needed to get back to the hollow and find a way to stop the source of the flames. But first I had to get past the circle of murderous skeletons that was closing in around me. One of the revenue agent skeletons, recognizable by the tattered remains of his badge, spoke in a voice I almost recognized. "Don't let him do to you what he did to us. End this before it's too late." For just a moment, the burning hatred faded from its empty sockets, replaced by something that looked like desperate hope. Then Ezekiel's voice boomed through the cave. "Get back in line, boys. We got work to do." The moment of clarity vanished, and the skeleton's face returned to murderous rage. But I'd seen enough. Some part of these dead agents was still fighting against Ezekiel's control. They didn't want to be here any more than I did, and that gave me an idea. I pressed myself against the cave wall as the circle of skeletons closed in. The revenue agent who'd spoken was closest to me, reaching out with bony fingers that still wore the corroded remains of a service ring. Up close, I could see something etched into the skull. Burn marks that formed letters. "William Hayes, 1943, I read aloud. The skeleton stopped moving. For a second, the red glow faded from its eye sockets. "Hayes?" I said. "Bill Hayes? I read about you in the training files. You disappeared during a raid on this hollow 30 years ago." The skeleton's jaw worked soundlessly, as if it was trying to speak but couldn't remember how. Then Ezekiel's voice cracked like a whip through the cave. "Shut up, revenue man! My boys don't need to remember their old names." But it was too late. I was already reading the next skull, and the next. Frank Morrison, 1951. James Cutler, 1962. Each name caused the corresponding skeleton to hesitate, confusion replacing rage in their empty sockets. "Stop!" Ezekiel's voice was losing some of its power, becoming more desperate than commanding. "They belong to me now." I pushed past the confused skeletons and ran back toward the main cave. Behind me, I could hear them beginning to fight among themselves, some trying to follow Ezekiel's orders, others struggling to remember who they'd been in life. The hollow was even worse when I emerged from the cave. All 6 barrels had exploded now, and the entire floor was covered in burning alcohol. The flames reached 20 feet into the air, turning the limestone walls black with soot. The heat was so intense that the air itself seemed to be on fire. Ezekiel was standing in the center of the inferno, arms raised like a conductor directing a symphony of destruction. Around him, the ghostly figures of his family danced through the flames, their forms becoming more solid as the fire grew stronger. "You can't stop this," he shouted when he saw me. "Every drop of shine that burns makes us stronger. Soon we'll have enough power to leave this hollow, to hunt down every federal agent in Kentucky." That's when I understood. This wasn't just about protecting a moonshine operation. Ezekiel was using the fires to fuel some kind of supernatural engine, building up enough energy to expand his influence beyond the hollow. If I didn't stop him now, every law enforcement officer in the state would be in danger. I looked around desperately for something I could use. The spring was still burning, but there had to be a source of water somewhere. Underground streams, maybe, or... My eyes fell on the still equipment. The copper pipes and cooling coils were designed to condense alcohol vapor back into liquid. But they could work in reverse, too. If I could heat them enough, I could turn liquid into vapor and create a massive pressure explosion. The problem was getting close enough. The largest kettle was in the middle of the fire, surrounded by dancing spirits that would tear me apart before I got within 10 feet. That's when I heard voices behind me. The skeletons from the cave were emerging, but they weren't all following Ezekiel's orders anymore. About half of them were moving with purpose, their eye sockets glowing with a different kind of light. They remembered who they were. Agent Hayes spoke first, his voice clearer now that he'd remembered his name. "Ezekiel killed us all, but he made a mistake. He kept us here to serve him, but that means we're still federal agents, and we still have a job to do." The other freed spirits nodded agreement. Agent Morrison stepped forward, his burned badge still faintly visible on his skeletal chest. "We've been trying to stop him for decades, but we couldn't act against him directly. He had too much power over us." "But you're alive," Agent Cutler added, his jaw clicking with each word. "You can do what we can't. Destroy the source of his power." I looked back at the massive still. "The main kettle?" "That's where it started," Hayes confirmed. "Ezekiel's first batch, the one he was making when we raided him in 1923. He'd made a deal with something dark, traded his soul for the perfect recipe. When we killed him, his dying breath cursed the whole operation. Every drop of alcohol produced here since then has been tainted with supernatural power." The heat from the burning hollow was becoming unbearable. My clothes were smoking, and I could feel my exposed skin starting to blister. But I forced myself to think clearly. If the main kettle was the source, I had to find a way to destroy it. "Can you distract him?" I asked the dead agents. Hayes nodded. "We can try, but you'll only have a few seconds. Once you start moving, he'll know what you're planning." I pulled off my ranger jacket and soaked it in the few drops of non-burning water I could find at the very edge of the spring. It wasn't much protection, but it might keep me from catching fire long enough to reach the still. "On 3, I said, wrapping the wet jacket around my head and shoulders. 1, 2, 3. The dead agents charged into the flames, grappling with Ezekiel and his family spirits. For a moment, the hollow filled with the sound of supernatural combat. Ghostly voices shouting, the crack of breaking bones, unearthly screams of rage and pain. I ran straight into the inferno. The heat was indescribable. Even through the wet jacket, I felt my hair singing and my skin beginning to cook. The flames reached for me like hungry animals, and I could hear Ezekiel screaming curses as he realized what I was doing. The main kettle was massive, easily 6 feet across and made of solid copper that had turned green with age. Strange symbols were etched all around its rim, the same markings I'd seen on the barrels and in the cave. But these were glowing now, pulsing with red light that seemed to come from deep inside the metal. I could see liquid moving in the kettle, but it wasn't alcohol. It was something dark and thick, like blood mixed with oil. As I watched, faces appeared in the liquid, screaming faces that I recognized as some of the revenue agents from the cave. This was where their souls were trapped. This was the source of Ezekiel's power. I raised my gun and emptied all 6 cylinders into the side of the kettle. The bullets struck the copper and passed right through, but instead of the metal ringing like a bell, each impact produced a sound like a human scream. Cracks appeared in the kettle's side, and the dark liquid began to seep out. Wherever it touched the ground, the supernatural flames began to flicker and dim. Ezekiel's voice rose to a howl of rage. "No! You don't understand what you're doing! That mixture has been brewing for 50 years. Without it, all the souls will be—" His words cut off as the kettle finally burst open like a dam breaking. The dark liquid poured out in a flood, and with it came dozens of glowing shapes, the souls of everyone who had died in the hollow, finally freed from their copper prison. The supernatural flames went out all at once, as if someone had blown out a giant candle. The temperature dropped so quickly that steam rose from the ground. In seconds, the hell-like inferno had become just another clearing in the Kentucky woods. Ezekiel and his family spirits were fading, too, becoming transparent as their source of power drained away. He looked at me with hatred so intense it was almost physical. "This isn't over," he snarled. "There are other hollows, other stills. The mountains remember, Revenue Man. And we'll be waiting." Then he was gone, along with all the other hostile spirits. Only the freed souls of the federal agents remained, glowing softly in the sudden darkness. Agent Hayes approached me, his form already becoming less distinct. "Thank you," he said simply. "We can rest now." One by one, the dead agents faded away, their souls finally free to move on. Agent Hayes was the last to go, saluting me with a skeletal hand before dissolving into points of light that drifted upward like fireflies. I stood alone in the smoking ruins of Devil's Hollow, surrounded by the wreckage of the supernatural still and the scattered bones of the dead. My radio crackled back to life, and I could hear Bill Henderson's voice calling for me. "Jake? Jake? Are you there? We saw smoke from the helicopter." I picked up the radio with shaking hands. "I'm here, Bill. Send in the fire crews, but tell them there's no hurry. The fire's out." The official report said that illegal moonshiners had been using the hollow for years and that their careless handling of high-proof alcohol had caused a flash fire that destroyed their equipment. The bones we found were labeled as casualties from various bootlegging operations over the decades, violent men who had died violent deaths in the Kentucky backwoods. Nobody questioned why there were no recent bodies, or how a fire hot enough to melt copper had burned out so quickly. The Forestry Service was happy to have another illegal still shut down, and the FBI was content to close several missing persons cases from the 1940s and 50s. I stayed on as a ranger for another 12 years until retirement forced me to hang up my badge. During that time, I investigated dozens of reports of supernatural activity in the National Forest. Most turned out to be nothing. Tourists spooked by unfamiliar sounds, lows, cows trying to keep visitors away from their favorite fishing spots. But some were real. I learned that the Kentucky mountains hold secrets older than human memory. There are places where the boundary between the living and the dead is thinner than tissue paper. And sometimes, when people die with enough hatred in their hearts, they don't stay dead. Ezekiel Hollow was gone, but he'd been telling the truth about one thing. There were other operations, other places where bootleggers had made deals with dark forces to protect their trade. I found 3 more over the years, smaller operations, easier to shut down because I knew what to look for. But I know there are more out there. The mountains remember everything, every death, every injustice, every drop of blood spilled on the forest floor. Most of the time, those memories sleep quietly in the deep places where the sun never shines. But sometimes they wake up, and when they do, they're hungry for revenge. I'm an old man now, living in a cabin not far from where Devil's Hollow used to be. The government cleaned up the site and planted new trees, but nothing grows there anymore. The ground is still poisoned by 50 years of supernatural moonshine production. Young rangers sometimes ask me for advice about strange reports from the deep woods. I tell them the same thing I tell everyone. Listen to the old-timers. Respect the mountains. And if you ever find a place where the locals warn you not to go, especially if they can't give you a good reason why, then you turn around and walk away. Because some secrets are meant to stay buried, and some debts are never fully paid. Just last week, I got a call from a ranger station in Tennessee. They'd found an abandoned still operation in a place the locals called Devil's Kitchen. The equipment was old, the ranger said, really old, with strange markings etched into the copper. And there were reports of strange lights at night and voices calling out in languages nobody recognized. I told them to contact the FBI to treat it as a federal crime scene, but I didn't. Tell them about the other things they might find. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share. Tonight, I'll sit on my porch and listen to the wind through the trees. And I'll remember the faces of Agent Hayes and the others. Good men who died trying to enforce the law in a place where normal laws don't apply. They're at peace now, but their sacrifice reminds me that the job isn't finished. Somewhere in these ancient mountains, in hollows so hidden that no map has ever marked them, the copper stills are still bubbling. The old recipes are still being followed, and the dead are still standing guard, waiting for the next federal agent who thinks he can shut down what should never have been started. My name is Jacob Stillwater, and I've seen things that would turn most people's hair white. But I sleep soundly because I know that someone has to remember, someone has to watch, and someone has to be ready for the day when the mountains decide to collect on all those old debts. The Moonshine Hollow may be gone, but the haunt remains. It always will, as long as there are mountains in Kentucky and people foolish enough to think they can make deals with the dark. Some things are better left alone. I learned that lesson 50 years ago, and I've never forgotten it. I just hope the next generation of rangers will be smart enough to learn it too, before they have to pay the same price I did, and the same price paid by all those brave men whose bones still rest in the caves beneath Devil's Hollow. The mountains remember, and they're always watching.